Imagine waking up to news that a storm with winds speeds over 400 miles per hour is forming in the Atlantic Ocean. Not a regular hurricane, but something much worse. A hypercane. This is a theoretical superstorm that scientists believe could form under very rare and extreme conditions. It would be like a hurricane, but way stronger, larger, and much more dangerous. And in this hypothetical, one is now brewing just off the coast. For a hypercane to form, ocean temperatures would have to rise to around 113 degrees Fahrenheit, which is way hotter than anything we've seen in the Atlantic. To compare, most hurricanes begin when ocean water is around 80 degrees. That means something drastic would have to happen, like an underwater volcanic eruption, or some kind of massive heat spike in the ocean. Once water reaches that level of heat, the atmosphere above it would become super unstable. The result could be a vertical column of rising air so powerful that it breaks into the upper layers of the atmosphere. This new storm would grow fast, much faster than any hurricane we've seen before. It could stretch for hundreds of miles and keep pulling in energy from the hot ocean below. Regular hurricanes lose power when they hit land, but a hypercane could stay strong much longer and cover more ground. It wouldn't just be a huge storm, it would be a machine feeding itself and growing stronger by the hour. Now imagine this hypercane spinning over the Atlantic. The pressure in its center would be so low that the winds around it would be pulled in at over 400 miles per hour, faster than the strongest tornadoes. These kinds of winds could rip roofs off buildings, snap steel towers, and turn debris into deadly projectiles. And this isn't just limited to coastal areas. A storm this powerful could keep pushing inland for hundreds of miles, flattening cities, towns, and infrastructure in its path. What makes this scarier is the storm surge. A hypercane could push walls of water inland, possibly reaching over 100 feet high. That's more than a 10-story building. Entire coastal cities could be underwater in hours. It wouldn't just be about evacuating. It would be about escaping before roads, bridges, and airports are swallowed up. The rainfall could also be record-breaking. Some scientists believe a hypercane could dump more rain in a single day than most hurricanes release in a week. This kind of storm would not just damage homes and roads, it would completely overwhelm emergency response systems. Power grids would fail, cell towers would collapse, and with so much flooding and wind damage, it might be weeks before help could reach some areas. And all of this is just what could happen in the first few days of a hypercane forming and making landfall along the Atlantic coast. Once the hypercane makes landfall and starts tearing through the east coast, the aftermath would look like something out of a science fiction movie. Cities near the coast would be hit first, and most of them wouldn't stand a chance against winds that strong. Skyscrapers could bend or break, glass would be flying everywhere, and even reinforced concrete structures might not hold up. But what makes this situation even more dangerous is what happens next. After the wind and storm surge, it's the total shutdown of daily life. Millions of people could be without power almost instantly. Power plants near the coastline would flood or shut down as a precaution, but even backup generators might fail. With no electricity, communication breaks down. Cell phones stop working. Internet service disappears, and even emergency radio systems could be knocked offline. It would be very hard to get information out, or in. Gas stations would be closed, grocery stores would be empty, and clean drinking water could be nearly impossible to find. A storm this powerful would rip apart water treatment plants, flood sewage systems, and contaminate freshwater supplies across entire regions. Hospitals would be pushed beyond their limits, especially in smaller towns. With roads blocked by fallen trees, crushed vehicles, and flooding, rescue teams might take days just to reach the worst-hit areas. But the damage wouldn't stop at buildings and roads. Farmland across the eastern United States could be destroyed. Crops would be flattened, soil washed away, and livestock killed or scattered. This would throw off the food supply chain in a huge way. Everything from corn and wheat to vegetables and fruit could see shortages within days. Grocery stores that still had power would be picked clean fast. The effects wouldn't just be felt locally. The ripple effect would travel across the country. Airports would shut down, both because of flooding and because there wouldn't be working radar or functioning control towers. Transportation of goods would grind to a halt. Ports along the East Coast, which handle millions of tons of cargo every year, would be wiped out or underwater. That means delays in everything from food and medicine to electronics and basic supplies. At the same time, the hypercane wouldn't just vanish once it moves inland. It would slowly weaken over time, but because it started off with so much energy, it could still bring major destruction as it moves. cities hundreds of miles from the coast, places like Atlanta, Pittsburgh, even parts of the Midwest, could see extreme rain, heavy winds, and dangerous base flooding. Rivers would overflow, dams could fail, and small towns far from the ocean would suddenly be in crisis. On top of all this, toxic spills and chemical leaks would become a real threat. Refineries and factories near the water could leak oil, gas, or industrial waste into floodwaters. These contaminants would spread fast, affecting not only marine life, but also human health. Cleanup would be massive, expensive, and take years to fully complete. And while all of this chaos is unfolding on the ground, scientists and emergency officials would be racing to understand whether another Hypercane could be forming behind the first one, especially if the ocean waters stayed hot. In the days and weeks after the Hypercane moved inland and lost strength, the real long-term consequences would start to reveal themselves. One of the biggest issues would be displacement. Millions of people from coastal cities like Miami, Charleston, New York City, and Boston could be forced to evacuate with no clear timeline for when or if they could return. Entire neighborhoods might be gone, not just damaged, but wiped completely off the map. Emergency shelters in nearby states would be overwhelmed. Schools, sports arenas, and community centers would be turned into makeshift homes for families that had lost everything. Sanitation would become a growing concern. Without proper plumbing or waste management, even shelters could become health risks. Disease outbreaks could begin to spread, especially in crowded and humid conditions. Insurance companies would be flooded with claims, not just for home damage, but for destroyed cars, lost businesses, and agricultural losses. But with so many claims coming in at once, the entire system could start to buckle. People might wait weeks or even months for the financial support they need just to rebuild. Many small businesses would shut down permanently. The local economy in the hardest hit regions could collapse entirely, leaving people jobless and unsure of what to do next. Meanwhile, the environmental damage wouldn't be limited to oil spills and broken infrastructure. The coastline itself would be reshaped. Barrier islands could be washed away. Wetlands and marshes, which serve as natural storm buffers, would be torn up or permanently eroded. Wildlife that depends on these habitats, birds, fish, amphibians, would either die off or flee the area entirely. Some ecosystems might never fully recover. The fisheries along the east coast would be devastated. Boats would be destroyed, docks ripped apart, and processing plants flooded. Saltwater intrusion from the storm surge would poison freshwater systems, ruining habitats and killing off fish populations. The fishing industry in places like Maine and the Carolinas could be crippled for years, leading to job losses and food shortages in surrounding areas. Then there's the mental impact. People who survive events like this often suffer from long-term trauma. Anxiety, depression, and PTSD are all common. Kids who live through these kinds of disasters might have trouble focusing in school, and adults might struggle to go back to their normal routines. Recovery is not just about rebuilding buildings, it's also about healing minds, and that takes much longer. International aid might be needed, especially if the federal government struggled to keep up with the demand for support. Countries around the world could step in with supplies, financial aid, and rescue teams. Global media would follow the story closely, and the world would be watching to see how the United States handled one of the most powerful storms in history. But beyond the headlines, experts would begin to ask tough questions. Could this happen again? Were early warning systems fast enough? Did climate change play a role in making the storm more intense? Researchers would dig into ocean temperature records, wind patterns, and pressure systems to try to understand exactly how the Hypercane had formed and whether more might be on the way. After the damage, the flooding, and the humanitarian crisis, attention would slowly shift toward the future. Scientists, engineers, and world leaders would gather to figure out what this Hypercane really meant. One of the biggest takeaways would be the need to seriously rethink coastal development. Cities that were once seen as booming coastal hubs might suddenly be considered too risky to rebuild. Discussions would begin about turning certain zones into permanent evacuation areas, or rebuilding them as green buffer zones instead of residential neighborhoods. Governments might start enforcing stricter building codes, requiring structures in storm-prone areas to withstand stronger winds and higher floods. Infrastructure planning would change too. Power lines could be moved underground. Seawalls might be built taller and wider, and emergency communication networks would be upgraded. More advanced radar and satellite technology would be funded to help detect changes in the atmosphere that might point to another Hypercane forming in the future. At the same time, global conversations around climate change would become much more urgent. A storm like this wouldn't just be seen as a one-time disaster, it would be viewed as a possible preview of what could come next if ocean temperatures continue to rise. World leaders would face pressure to take stronger action, not just in reducing carbon emissions, but in preparing for even more extreme weather events. The storm would also reshape how people think about weather in general. For most of history, hurricanes have been categorized using the Saffir-Simpson scale, which goes from Category 1 to Category 5. But a Hypercane would go far beyond that. Meteorologists might consider creating a new classification system, something that acknowledges how this kind of storm breaks all the usual rules. In schools, kids would learn about the Hypercane the way past generations learned about major earthquakes or world wars as a moment in history that changed everything. Documentaries would be made, books would be written, and survivors would tell their stories for years to come. In some cities, memorials might be built to honor the lives lost and the communities forever changed. Economically, recovery would take years. Insurance rates for coastal areas would skyrocket, and some companies might refuse to cover those regions at all. Tourism in coastal cities would slow down, especially in places where popular beaches or boardwalks were damaged beyond recognition. Farming regions, affected by saltwater contamination or flood damage, would struggle to grow crops, adding pressure to food supply chains already stretched thin. But as hard as it would be, the world would also adapt. New technologies might emerge to help manage storms, things like artificial cloud seeding, sea surface cooling, or better global weather control models. Scientists would likely work together across borders, combining research to better understand what triggered the Hypercane and how to prevent another. Most importantly, people would not forget. A Hypercane hitting the Atlantic Ocean wouldn't just be a disaster, it would be a warning. A reminder of how powerful nature can be and how closely human life is tied to the balance of our environment. The damage would be real. The loss would be massive, but the lessons learned might just help protect future generations from facing something even worse. Yeah. Thanks for sticking with me through this intense hypothetical. Let me know what you think would happen if a Hypercane ever formed in real life. And don't forget to check out our other video on rare weather events that science says could still happen. Imagine waking up one morning and looking up to see nothing but a clear blue sky stretching in every direction. Not a single cloud, not a wisp, just open air from horizon to horizon. That's what it would be like if, suddenly, every single cloud on Earth vanished forever. No more fluffy cumulus, no more dark storm clouds, no more high cirrus streaks. It sounds calm and peaceful at first, but the reality would be anything but. Clouds aren't just decorations in the sky. They're a key part of how the Earth works. One of their biggest jobs is regulating temperature. During the day, clouds reflect sunlight away from the planet, keeping things from getting too hot. At night, they act like a blanket, trapping heat close to the ground and stopping it from escaping into space. If you take all the clouds away, you're basically removing Earth's climate control system. Right away, we'd notice some strange things happening. Days would feel way hotter than usual. Without clouds to reflect the sun, more heat would hit the surface directly. In places that are already warm, like deserts or tropical regions near the equator, the temperatures could rise dangerously high in just the first day. Surfaces like asphalt, metal roofs, or dry soil would absorb that heat even faster, and you'd feel it the moment you stepped outside. Nights, on the other hand, would flip the other direction. With no clouds to trap heat, the warmth from the day would vanish quickly. Even places that baked in the sun all day would get surprisingly cold once the sun went down. These intense ups and downs would happen every single day, and the temperature swings would only get worse over time. Animals and plants that rely on regular day-night temperatures would be thrown into chaos. Many species have adapted to the way clouds regulate light and warmth. Without that stability, their daily patterns would break. Some might not survive the sudden shift. Human bodies, too, would struggle with these extreme swings, especially in regions where people aren't used to big temperature changes. And this is just what happens in the very beginning, within the first few days of clouds disappearing. It would be the start of something much bigger. Earth's weather, agriculture, and climate would all begin to unravel. Next, we'll look at how those disappearing clouds would start to mess with weather patterns, global wind systems, and the water cycle, and why that would change everything we know about life on this planet. With all the clouds gone, it wouldn't just be the days and nights that start acting strange. The entire system that moves weather around the planet would be thrown off. Clouds are deeply connected to how air moves, where storms form, and how rain falls. Without them, weather as we know it would break down fast. One of the biggest problems would be the collapse of the water cycle. Normally, water from oceans, lakes, rivers, and even plants evaporates into the air. That water vapor then gathers into clouds, which eventually release it as rain or snow. No clouds means no place for that vapor to collect, so it just lingers in the air or spreads out too thinly to do anything. That leads to massive drops in rainfall, especially in places that depend on regular storms or seasonal rains. Think about areas like the Amazon rainforest, which gets huge amounts of rain thanks to thick cloud cover and strong cycles of evaporation and condensation. With clouds gone, the rain stops. And when the rain stops, the forest begins to dry out. Over time, a rainforest could turn into dry, cracked land with dying trees, shrinking rivers, and collapsing ecosystems. The same thing would happen to farmland in places like Southeast Asia, Central Africa, or parts of the American Midwest, where crops rely heavily on cloud-fed rain. Wind systems would also go through major changes. Without clouds reflecting sunlight unevenly across Earth's surface, temperature patterns would become more extreme, and that changes how air moves. Normally, warm air rises and cool air sinks, driving the winds that help move moisture, heat, and storm systems across the globe. But now, with clouds gone, some regions would heat up way too fast while others freeze, creating weird and violent wind patterns. We'd likely see jet streams shift, storms becoming more chaotic, and some areas being permanently stuck in dry, windless heat, while others face constant gusts and sandstorms. Humidity would also behave differently. Since there would be less rain and no clouds to trap moisture near the ground, some places would feel bone dry all the time. Deserts would expand quickly, creeping into areas that used to be green and livable. On the other hand, coastal regions might get stuck with thick, sticky air full of water vapor that can't condense into rain. That strange combo, hot, heavy air and no rain, would make life incredibly uncomfortable and even dangerous for people with breathing problems or health conditions. With no reliable weather, long-term forecasting would become almost impossible. Farmers, city planners, and emergency responders would be left guessing. Droughts would hit unexpectedly. Flash floods could happen where dry soil can't absorb rare, sudden downpours. Even the seasons might stop working the way we know them, and this is still just the beginning. In the next part, we'll dig into how a cloudless world would affect our oceans, the wildlife that lives in them, and what happens to Earth's balance when the skies stay clear forever. Oceans would feel the disappearance of clouds just as much as the land would, maybe even more. Without any cloud cover, the surface of the oceans would absorb much more sunlight than normal. That would quickly cause sea surface temperatures to rise, not by a little, but by several degrees across the globe within just a few weeks. Warmer oceans change everything. Coral reefs would be among the first to suffer. Corals are very sensitive to temperature changes, and even a shift of just 1 or 2 degrees over normal can lead to coral bleaching. Without clouds to shade the water or help control the heating, entire reef systems like the Great Barrier Reef could start dying off in just a matter of months. That would destroy the homes of thousands of marine species and disrupt fishing industries that millions of people rely on. The warmer ocean water would also expand, which adds to sea level rise. Add in melting polar ice, since there are no clouds to help reflect sunlight off the white surface of glaciers, and you'd get serious coastal flooding. Cities like Miami, Bangkok, and Venice would all be at greater risk of permanent flooding within a few years, and places that already sit just above sea level, like small island nations, could be underwater faster than anyone expects. Marine animals wouldn't just deal with warmer waters, but with changes in food supply too. Phytoplankton, which are tiny plants that float near the surface and produce oxygen, need sunlight to grow, but they also need cooler, nutrient-rich water. If the surface of the ocean stays too hot, those nutrients don't rise from the deeper layers like they normally do. That causes plankton populations to crash, which then affects fish, whales, and everything else up the food chain. Storms that form over water, like tropical cyclones, would also change. While clouds are a key part of storm formation, the energy that drives storms comes from the heat in the ocean. With hotter water and broken wind patterns, new kinds of storms could develop that we've never seen before. They might be shorter but more intense, or slower and longer lasting. And since the old systems that used to push storms around are gone or broken, some areas could get hit again and again with no clear pattern. Even the chemistry of the ocean would shift. With more sunlight hitting the water and fewer processes to regulate evaporation and heat, Salinity could rise in some areas, while freshwater runoff might cause imbalances in others. These shifts would confuse migration patterns for many marine animals and might lead to dead zones, parts of the ocean where nothing can survive due to lack of oxygen or extreme temperatures. And let's not forget about the poles. With no clouds to keep the temperature in check, the Arctic and Antarctic regions would melt even faster than they already are. That would not only raise sea levels, but also release large amounts of methane from permafrost, a greenhouse gas far more powerful than carbon dioxide. Once that's in the atmosphere, it speeds up the warming even more, creating a runaway effect. As we wrap up, we'll look at how these changes ripple into society, from food systems and health to daily life and global cooperation in a world where clouds never return. With every single cloud on Earth gone forever, daily life for people everywhere would start to feel completely unfamiliar. For one, energy demand would spike. Places that never needed air conditioning before, like parts of Northern Europe or coastal Canada, would suddenly be overwhelmed by heat. Buildings not designed to handle extreme temperatures would become unlivable during the day and dangerously cold at night. That's because without clouds, there's nothing to slow down heat loss after the sun sets. So, while it would be blazing hot during the day, temperatures could plummet overnight, creating massive energy swings every 24 hours. In areas that rely heavily on hydropower, like Norway or the Pacific Northwest in the United States, disappearing clouds would mean fewer storms, less snow, and eventually dried up rivers that would hurt clean energy supplies right when people need it most. Meanwhile, solar energy would see a temporary boost with more constant sunlight, but that could be short-lived. Dust, dry air, and disrupted wind patterns might bring new problems like massive sandstorms or haze that block sunlight anyway. Cities would also face big health problems. Without cloud cover, UV radiation would increase sharply. That means more cases of skin cancer, eye damage, and heat stroke, especially in regions that are already exposed to a lot of sun. Hospitals could become overwhelmed in just a few months as heat-related illness and dehydration cases climb. Air quality would also take a hit. With no rain clouds to help clear out pollutants from the atmosphere, smog would linger longer and hang heavier over large urban areas. Agriculture would be pushed into a full crisis mode. Farmers would have to completely rework how they grow food. Crops that depend on consistent rain or cooler temperatures, like wheat, coffee, and rice, would fail in many areas. Some places would shift to drought-resistant crops, but others might become unsuitable for farming altogether. Entire food supply chains could collapse. Countries that rely on imported food might find themselves scrambling to secure new trade deals, as everyone competes for shrinking supplies. That leads to rising food prices, increased poverty, and possibly even conflicts. Even mental health would take a hit. Believe it or not, clouds help people regulate their daily rhythm. With nothing but harsh, constant sunlight or deep, sudden darkness, people's sleep patterns would be thrown off. In some regions, people might go for weeks without a cloudy or overcast day, leading to more cases of anxiety, depression, and sleep disorders. The psychological toll of watching nature unravel, watching ecosystems collapse, wildlife vanish, and skies remain a harsh, empty blue day after day, would weigh on entire communities. Governments and international groups would likely try to respond fast. We could see a push for the large-scale geoengineering projects, like releasing particles into the upper atmosphere to reflect sunlight, or building artificial cloud systems over important agricultural zones. Some might even develop advanced systems to release moisture into the air and try to restart cloud formation artificially, though these experiments would carry major risks. If the balance of moisture, heat, and air movement is not right, these efforts could make the problem worse or shift it onto another part of the world. In the end, the disappearance of every cloud on Earth would reveal just how connected everything is. Clouds aren't just something we look at in the sky. They're part of what makes life on Earth possible. Without them, the balance falls apart. Temperature, weather, ecosystems, water, health, all of it starts to unravel. And it's a reminder that sometimes the things we barely notice, like clouds drifting by overhead, are some of the most important forces keeping our world in balance. Imagine waking up one morning in the year 2025, and suddenly your phone has no signal, your Wi-Fi is down, and the power in your entire neighborhood has vanished. Not just your town or your city. Millions of people are in the same situation all over the world. This isn't the result of a power plant issue or a cyber attack. This is a full-blown solar superstorm, erupting with the same strength as the Carrington event from the year 1859, but happening today. Let's be clear, this is a hypothetical scenario, but it's one based on very real science. The Carrington event was the most powerful solar storm ever recorded. Back then, it lit up the skies with bright auroras and even set telegraph systems on fire. Now imagine that same level of solar activity slamming into a world that relies on satellites, GPS, internet, and massive interconnected power grids. It's not just a science fiction idea, it's something experts say is possible and maybe even overdue. The sun goes through an 11-year cycle of solar activity. Some years are quiet, while others are loaded with flares and sunspots. During active periods, the sun can launch what's called a coronal mass ejection, or CME. That's when a huge bubble of charged particles and magnetic energy blasts out into space. If the timing and direction are just right, or just wrong, depending how you look at it, it can hit Earth straight on, and that's exactly what happened in 1859. But back then, people didn't have smartphones, air traffic control, or millions of miles of high-voltage power lines. All they had were basic electrical systems, mostly telegraph lines, and even those were fried. Some operators reported electric shocks from their equipment. Now fast forward to today, everything from planes to hospitals to stock markets depends on systems that are much more sensitive. If a Carrington-level solar storm hit today, we wouldn't just see pretty lights in the sky. In the very first hours, the Earth's magnetic field would go into chaos, power grids would be slammed with unexpected electrical currents, transformers could overheat and explode, high-frequency radio used by aircraft and ships might completely drop out. We could lose access to GPS signals, which are used by everything from delivery services to farming equipment. Even oil pipelines could be affected, with pressure and flow data going haywire due to false readings caused by magnetic interference. Satellites would be one of the first to suffer. The intense radiation could fry circuits and knock out communication satellites and weather monitoring systems. The International Space Station might have to power down or shift to a safe mode. All the services that rely on satellites, navigation, television, phone calls, internet, banking could fail within minutes. And this isn't something that would only affect one part of the world. This would be a global problem. That's what makes this scenario so scary. It's not a localized disaster, it's worldwide. And here's where it gets even more serious. The warning time would be very short. Scientists might only have 12 to 18 hours from detecting a major solar flare to the arrival of the charged particles on Earth. That doesn't give much time for governments or energy companies to shut down and protect sensitive systems. There are alert systems in place, like those run by NASA and the NOAA in the United States, but they can only do so much. Once the storm is on its way, there's no stopping it. So what would those first 24 hours look like? Chaos, panic, confusion. People wouldn't be able to contact loved ones, banks could shut down, emergency services might have trouble coordinating, traffic lights would go dark, air traffic control could lose radar, flights might be grounded, and this is just the beginning. The world isn't prepared for a solar event like the one that happened over 160 years ago. Back then, the worst that happened was some sparks and confusion. Today, a storm of that size would hit every part of our lives all at once with very little warning. That's just the beginning of what a Carrington-level event could do in the modern world. The real damage would unfold in the days and weeks that follow, as we'll see next. As the first day of the solar superstorm wraps up, the immediate effects are already devastating. With satellites and communication systems down, the next few hours become a critical time. Power grids, already overloaded with geomagnetically induced currents, begin to fail in large parts of the world. Some areas experience total blackouts, while others deal with rolling outages that could stretch on for weeks, depending on the severity of the damage. And it's not just the power. Transportation systems are in disarray. Without GPS signals, planes are grounded, ships can't navigate, and trains come to a halt. The chaos isn't confined to just the electrical and communications networks. The impact is felt across almost every industry. Hospitals struggle to function as backup power systems are quickly depleted, medical equipment heavily reliant on electricity goes offline, and critical systems for monitoring patient health and administering treatment falter. The consequences for healthcare could be severe, with urgent care centers unable to access patient records, or worse, unable to assist patients in emergency situations. People in need of life-saving procedures would find themselves at the mercy of an overwhelmed system that's barely hanging on. The financial markets are among the hardest hit. Global stock exchanges grind to a halt as trading systems collapse, unable to process transactions. In an era of digital financial systems, this could lead to massive disruptions in buying, selling, and investing. The flow of money would cease, causing panic, particularly in the banking sector. People would rush to ATMs to withdraw cash, but the machines might not work, leaving many with no access to their funds. While the full economic impact of this solar storm would take time to reveal itself, it's likely that the damage would amount to billions, if not trillions, of dollars. At the same time, the agricultural sector would begin to feel the effects of the storm. Modern farming relies heavily on technology, whether it's GPS-guided machinery for planting and harvesting crops or automated systems for managing irrigation. Without those systems functioning, the efficiency of farming operations would drop dramatically. Farmers might find themselves unable to plant or harvest crops on time, leading to food shortages. Supply chains would struggle to keep up with demand, making it difficult to move food from farms to grocery stores, which would increase prices and possibly trigger widespread panic buying. Basic necessities like food, water, and fuel would quickly become scarce in many places. The consequences would be felt around the world. Nations relying on international trade for vital resources would find themselves unable to import or export goods. In the United States alone, the Department of Energy estimates that a major solar storm could knock out a large portion of the country's electrical grid for a period of months, if not longer. And because many of the transformers that power these grids take months or even years to replace, recovery would be slow and painful. The real danger of a Carrington-level solar storm is that it isn't just an event that passes over. The disruptions caused by the initial impact could stretch into weeks, months, and even years. As industries and infrastructure struggle to recover, society would be forced to adapt. People would have to figure out how to function without the conveniences they rely on every day, from smartphones to online banking. Food shortages could become more severe, and access to clean waters might become a challenge in regions where treatment plants are affected by power failures. The environmental impact of the solar storm would also be significant. Satellite-based weather monitoring systems would be down, making it harder to predict and prepare for other natural disasters like hurricanes or wildfires. The inability to monitor the atmosphere could lead to unexpected environmental damage, further compounding the challenges of survival in a post-superstorm world. As we move into the following days, the initial chaos from the solar storm continues to unfold. The world is not prepared for something of this scale, and people start to realize just how fragile our reliance on technology truly is. But this is only the beginning. The ripple effects of a solar storm like this would continue to affect every part of life, and the true extent of the damage wouldn't be clear for weeks, months, or even longer. The recovery process, once it begins, will be far from simple. It will take coordination, innovation, and a major effort to rebuild the systems we've come to rely on so heavily. In the next part, we'll look into what happens when the dust settles and how the world would attempt to recover. As the days pass after the solar superstorm, the damage continues to unfold. The initial panic has begun to settle, but the long-term effects of the event are now becoming painfully apparent. Communities are still grappling with widespread power outages. While some parts of the world may have managed to restore basic electricity, entire regions remain without power. The cost to repair the electrical grids is astronomical, and the lack of trained personnel and equipment to replace destroyed transformers only adds to the delay. In some areas, it's estimated that it could take years to fully restore power, leaving entire populations to live without the conveniences of modern life. With the electricity still a scarce commodity, many of the world's technological systems remain compromised. Communication networks reliant on satellite connections remain largely offline. While some ground-based systems may have been partially restored, most of the world's cell towers and internet connections are still out of commission. In the absence of reliable communication, communities turn to more primitive methods, like radio broadcasts, to stay informed. However, even these become increasingly difficult to maintain as resources, including fuel for generators, grow thinner. The loss of global connectivity means that people feel more isolated, with a growing divide between those who still have access to information and those who do not. Transportation continues to struggle. Without GPS, air travel is severely hindered. Commercial flights are grounded, and air traffic control systems remain overwhelmed by the backlog of canceled flights. With no reliable way of navigating, airports become chaotic hubs, as people are stranded and unsure when they can return to their homes or reach other destinations. The already stressed transportation system begins to falter under the weight of the crisis. Ground transportation, like trains and buses, also face interruptions due to electrical failures. Some vehicles that rely on electric systems simply stop working, and the lack of fuel due to distribution issues only exacerbates the problem. The agricultural sector, which initially faced struggles, now begins to show signs of collapse in some regions. Fields lie fallow, crops are lost, and the logistical nightmare of delivering food becomes even more critical. While some food production has been salvaged by local farming operations that are more self-sustaining, the global supply chain continues to suffer. The economy of many nations takes a severe hit as businesses shut down or reduce their operations due to the lack of communication and energy to power their production lines. The loss of critical infrastructure means that industries that rely on just-in-time supply chains, like manufacturing, can't keep up with demand, which affects everything from electronics to clothing to car parts. Even in areas with food, prices soar as supply becomes strained and the demand for basic goods increases. Meanwhile, healthcare systems remain under incredible strain. Hospitals, still reeling from the initial failure of medical devices and power outages, struggle to provide care. Emergency medical equipment like ventilators and dialysis machines, which are dependent on a constant electricity supply, are still inoperable in many places. The ripple effect continues to affect people's health with delayed treatments and surgeries. People with chronic conditions are at risk, and the long-term effects on health will compound the crisis in the months ahead. Medical professionals are overwhelmed, and many struggle with the added pressure of not being able to rely on technology that once helped save lives. The social implications of the solar storm become more pronounced as well. As time goes on, people begin to experience more tension and frustration with each passing day. Basic services are disrupted, leading to growing unrest in some parts of the world. Food riots break out in urban areas where access to necessities is most limited. Communities that are already facing socioeconomic challenges are hit the hardest. The divide between the rich and the poor grows wider, with wealthier areas able to secure limited resources while poorer ones face increasing scarcity. In addition to the human cost, the environment also feels the long-term consequences of the solar superstorm. With satellites still down, scientists are unable to monitor weather systems as effectively as they once could. This lack of data leads to significant challenges in forecasting natural disasters. Floods, hurricanes, and wildfires, which were once more predictable, now pose an even greater threat. Without satellite monitoring, predicting the movement and intensity of storms becomes a game of chance. This leads to a lack of preparation and, in some cases, devastating losses when natural disasters hit unexpectedly. The global economy is also starting to unravel. Trade, which relies heavily on digital communication, remains at a standstill. International businesses struggle to manage logistics without reliable systems in place, and governments scramble to fill the gaps. Banks, which rely on digital records for processing transactions, face crippling delays. As stock markets continue to fluctuate and trade disruptions affect companies worldwide, the full economic impact of this solar storm is becoming clearer. Economists predict that the global economy could shrink by a staggering amount, with losses reaching trillions of dollars. While the initial chaos of the event has calmed somewhat, the lasting effects are only beginning to be felt. Recovery will take years, if not decades, and the world will have to adapt to a new reality, one where the reliance on technology that once seemed invulnerable is now seen as fragile and vulnerable. Societies will have to rethink how they interact with the digital world and rebuild the systems that make life possible in the modern age. But even as recovery efforts begin, the question remains: when will the next Carrington-level solar superstorm strike? And will we be any more prepared the next time it happens? The lessons learned from this event could be our only hope for safeguarding the future. As the world continues to recover from the devastating effects of the solar superstorm, it becomes clear that the long-term repercussions will be felt for generations. The rebuilding process is slow, and many systems that once seemed invincible are now being reevaluated. One of the most immediate challenges in the aftermath of the storm is the worldwide push to adapt and fortify infrastructure against future solar activity. Governments, industries, and scientists have come together in a global effort to ensure that, if a similar event were to happen again, humanity's better prepared. The first steps in this rebuilding effort are focused on strengthening power grids. Engineers work tirelessly to create more resilient electrical systems that can better withstand geomagnetic storms. The process is costly, with some estimates suggesting that billions of dollars will be spent on upgrading grid infrastructure. A focus is placed on replacing outdated transformers with more advanced models capable of handling the surge of energy that a solar storm could cause. Additionally, there is growing investment in the development of backup systems that can keep critical facilities running in the event of power outages, such as hospitals and emergency services. While progress is being made, many experts warn that it will take decades before the global electrical grid can be fully fortified against the threat of a solar superstorm. In the space sector, lessons learned from the disruption to satellite systems are driving innovation. The vulnerability of communication satellites to radiation damage is now a major concern. The industry has already begun to focus on creating more robust and radiation-resistant satellites. These new satellites will feature enhanced shielding and the ability to recover from temporary outages caused by solar storms. However, it's not just about strengthening the satellites themselves. More attention is now being given to creating better early warning systems that can predict solar activity and provide enough time for satellites to be put into protective modes before being hit by solar flares. This could help prevent complete system failures and reduce the amount of time it takes to restore communication networks after a solar storm. On the ground, communities that were hit hardest by the solar storm continue to rebuild, but many face significant challenges. Rural areas that were disconnected from the global network for months or even years have started to focus on more localized energy solutions, like solar panels and wind turbines, to reduce their reliance on the vulnerable power grid. However, implementing these systems on a large scale is expensive and requires the support of governments and businesses to ensure that renewable energy becomes a viable option for communities in need. The reality is that without these alternative power solutions, many areas could remain at the mercy of solar activity for years to come. As time goes on, social and political dynamics also change. Many governments now place more emphasis on disaster preparedness, with the realization that technological infrastructure must be made more resilient to the increasing frequency of space weather events. In some regions, emergency response systems are being overhauled, and plans are put in place to ensure that people can stay informed during future disasters. There is a growing recognition that the fragility of modern systems means that societal structures could break down in the face of widespread disruption, and thus new frameworks must be established to deal with such crises. The economic recovery remains slow. Supply chains that rely on precise timing and digital systems still struggle to return to full functionality. While some industries have managed to adapt to the new reality, others face ongoing difficulties. The global economy, once highly interconnected and reliant on advanced technology, is now operating in a more fragmented way. This shift has led to greater self-sufficiency in some countries, while others face increasing isolation. The lack of global coordination has been one of the most significant setbacks in recovery efforts, as nations work at their own pace to rebuild what was lost. The impact of the solar superstorm also brings about a cultural shift. People, once accustomed to instant communication and constant digital connectivity, now have a deeper understanding of the vulnerabilities of their technology. There's a growing awareness of how dependent society has become on systems that, in many ways, were never designed to withstand the force of a natural event like a solar storm. In many places, communities have started to rethink how they engage with technology, with some even returning to older methods of communication and transportation. People become more focused on local and sustainable living, trying to become less reliant on the global system that, in a single moment, can fail them. Looking forward, researchers continue to study solar activity, hoping to gain a better understanding of the sun's behavior and develop more accurate prediction models. While the next Carrington-level event could be centuries away or right around the corner, the global community has learned valuable lessons from the last disaster. In a world where technology is so deeply integrated into our daily lives, the importance of preparedness cannot be overstated. The recovery from a solar superstorm, like the one we just experienced, may take years, but with each lesson learned, humanity grows stronger and more resilient in the face of natural events that we can only begin to understand. As we move forward, we'll carry the knowledge that the next solar storm is just as unpredictable as the one we've just lived through, and we must be ready for it. When people hear the word megathrust, it might not sound like much, but in the world of natural disasters, it's one of the most dangerous things that can happen. A megathrust earthquake is not your typical ground-shaking event. A These are the massive quakes that happen where two tectonic plates collide, with one being pushed under the other. These collisions happen in subduction zones, and when they release all that built-up pressure, the result can be truly devastating. To get an idea of what this could look like, we only need to go back to the year 2011, when Japan experienced one of the most powerful megathrust earthquakes ever recorded. That quake struck off the coast of Tohoku and caused not just intense ground shaking, but also a giant tsunami that swept inland, destroying entire towns and causing over $360 billion in damages. That single event remains one of the costliest natural disasters in history, and it shows just how dangerous these types of earthquakes really are. Now imagine if something like that were to happen again, but this time in a different part of the world that isn't as well prepared. Scientists have been warning about the Cascadia subduction zone along the Pacific Northwest coast of the United States. This fault runs from Northern California all the way up to British Columbia, and it has been quiet for a long time, maybe too long. Experts believe that if the Cascadia fault were to rupture in a full megathrust event, it could result in a quake larger than magnitude 9. That's strong enough to shake the ground for minutes, not just seconds, which is more than enough time to cause serious destruction. The first wave of damage would come from the shaking itself. Buildings not designed to handle that kind of movement would crumble. Bridges could collapse. Roads would crack wide open, and power lines would snap. People in cities like Seattle, Portland, and Vancouver could be hit hard, and even areas far inland would feel the effects. Hospitals and emergency services would likely be overwhelmed right away, especially if communication systems go down too. But the shaking is just the beginning. One of the most dangerous parts of a megathrust earthquake is the tsunami that usually follows. Because the ocean floor gets violently shoved upward during the quake, it sends a massive surge of water racing across the sea. In some places, there would only be a few minutes of warning. Entire coastal communities could be swallowed by waves taller than houses. In low-lying towns near the coast, there would be little time to get to higher ground. What makes megathrust earthquakes so scary is that they don't just affect one city or one area. They can impact whole regions at once. Ports, airports, highways, and train systems could all be knocked out in a matter of minutes, and once that happens, getting supplies, rescue crews, or even basic help into the disaster zone becomes incredibly difficult. Even the ground itself could change forever. These earthquakes can cause the land to drop several feet, which means that some places that used to be above sea level could suddenly find themselves permanently underwater. That's not just a short-term problem, that's long-term flooding that could wipe towns right off the map. This is why scientists are so focused on megathrust earthquakes. They don't happen often, but when they do, the damage is off the charts. The next one could hit without warning, and if it does, the question is not just where or when, it's how bad will it be. One of the biggest challenges with megathrust earthquakes is how little warning people get before they strike. Unlike hurricanes or storms that can be tracked days in advance, these earthquakes happen deep beneath the surface, where pressure quietly builds over decades or even centuries. Then suddenly, everything gives way. That moment when all the energy is released at once is what makes these events so powerful and dangerous. Researchers are using tools like GPS satellites and deep sea sensors to try and understand where this stress is building and how close we might be to a major event. These tools can detect tiny movements in the Earth's crust, sometimes just a few millimeters a year, but over time those tiny shifts mean something big is coming. Some areas, like the Pacific Northwest, have been slowly moving for hundreds of years without a large quake to release that pressure, and when it finally does happen, it won't be a small release. It'll be the kind of sudden, violent shift that sends shock waves for hundreds of miles in every direction. The damage wouldn't just stop at buildings and roads. A megathrust earthquake would also severely impact basic infrastructure, especially utilities. Power grids would be knocked out, gas lines could rupture and catch fire, and water systems could break down entirely. That could leave millions of people without electricity, clean water, or heat. Especially if it happens during colder months. In coastal areas, sea walls and flood defenses might be destroyed by the tsunami, leaving communities vulnerable to more damage after the initial impact. And then there's the economic side. Ports that serve as hubs for imports and exports could be destroyed in minutes. In the United States alone, ports like Seattle and Portland handle billions of dollars worth of goods each year. If those are shut down, supply chains would be disrupted, not just locally, but globally. Everything from food and fuel to electronics and medicine could suddenly become hard to get. Large businesses might have backup plans, but small businesses and everyday people would struggle to bounce back. Insurance claims would flood in, and rebuilding would take years. Even 10 years after the quake in Japan in the year 2011, some coastal towns were still struggling to recover. Now imagine that kind of damage happening in several countries at once. That's the scale we're talking about when it comes to a megathrust earthquake. One of the most serious problems would be housing. With thousands or even hundreds of thousands of buildings damaged or destroyed, many people would be forced to leave their homes. Emergency shelters would fill quickly, and some people might not be able to return home for months or even years. In areas hit hardest by tsunamis, entire neighborhoods might be gone altogether. That kind of displacement can have long-lasting effects on families, schools, and entire communities. What makes all of this even more difficult is that megathrust earthquakes often strike areas that are heavily populated and near the ocean. That means there's a higher risk for loss of life, damage to property, and disruption to everyday life. These aren't isolated mountain regions with few people. They're often major cities, ports, and transportation centers that millions of people rely on every single day. And while scientists are getting better at understanding where these events are most likely to happen, predicting exactly when they will hit is still impossible. That's why so many researchers are focused on preparation rather than prediction, because when the next one hits, and it will be too late to prepare. One of the most dangerous things about a megathrust earthquake is what follows it. Massive aftershocks that can last for weeks or even months. Aftershocks might not be as strong as the initial quake, but they still cause serious damage, especially to already weakened buildings and roads, hospitals, emergency shelters, and communication systems that barely held together after the first quake could collapse entirely during one of these follow-up quakes. In addition to the shaking, the ground itself can shift in ways that completely change the landscape. In past megathrust earthquakes, entire coastlines have moved. In the year 2011, parts of Japan's shoreline shifted by more than 8 feet. That kind of sudden land movement can change the course of rivers, damage pipelines, and even affect underground aquifers. Bridges, railways, and highways could be left twisted or broken, cutting off entire regions from help. One of the most overlooked threats that follows a megathrust earthquake is disease. When clean water is hard to come by, sanitation systems are broken, and thousands of people are packed into emergency shelters, it creates the perfect conditions for illness to spread. In the aftermath of past earthquakes, outbreaks of stomach viruses, respiratory infections, and skin diseases have been common. If it happens in colder climates, things like hypothermia and frostbite also become major concerns, especially if heating systems are down for long periods. Farming regions near subduction zones would also be hit hard. Farmland could be flooded by tsunamis, contaminated with salt water, or completely shifted by the force of the quake. Crops could be wiped out for the season, and irrigation systems might be destroyed. That means fewer food supplies, higher prices, and even shortages, especially if supply lines are already down due to damage at ports and roads. There's also the mental toll. Survivors of megathrust earthquakes often deal with trauma, stress, and anxiety for years afterward. The constant fear of aftershocks, the uncertainty about whether homes and schools will ever be rebuilt, and the loss of loved ones all take a toll on people's health and well-being. Children in particular are deeply affected by the sudden change in routine and the chaos around them. Another long-term concern is how such a disaster would affect global cooperation. If multiple countries are hit at once, or if one country is hit so hard that it needs outside help, there could be competition for resources. Things like rescue crews, medical supplies, construction materials, and even food aid might not be available in large enough quantities to help everyone right away. This can lead to tension, especially if the disaster disrupts diplomatic or trade relationships. Scientists have even warned that megathrust earthquakes could trigger additional earthquakes in nearby regions. When one fault shifts, it can sometimes cause pressure to build up in surrounding faults. That means a single massive earthquake could start a chain reaction of seismic activity in places that weren't even directly hit at first. That kind of domino effect could cause problems across entire continents. Finally, there's the environmental cost. Landslides caused by the earthquake could bury forests, rivers could become blocked or redirected, and chemical spills from damaged factories or power plants could leak into the soil and air. In areas where nuclear power plants sit near fault lines or coastlines, there's also the fear of radiation leaks. These environmental disasters can take decades to clean up and may leave some areas unsafe to live in for generations. When we think about the next megathrust earthquake, one of the most important things to talk about is how communities can prepare before it happens. In places near subduction zones like the Pacific Northwest, emergency planners are focusing more and more on building codes. Stronger rules mean new buildings must be designed to sway with the ground rather than crack and fall. These changes might seem small, but they can save thousands of lives when a major earthquake hits. One major concern for coastal towns is evacuation. Because megathrust earthquakes often cause tsunamis, people near the ocean only have a short window, sometimes just 10 to 15 minutes, to get to high ground. That's why communities in places like Oregon, Washington, and parts of British Columbia have started building vertical evacuation towers. These structures are specially designed to withstand the shaking and the waves, giving people a place to run if there's no time to drive inland. In many areas, especially along the Ring of Fire, scientists are pushing for better early warning systems. These systems can detect the first signs of a quake and send out alerts before the worst shaking starts. In Japan, for example, their system can give people up to a minute of warning. That may not sound like much, but it's enough time to stop trains, shut down gas lines, and tell people to get to safety. The hope is that more countries will invest in these systems before the next disaster strikes. Schools and hospitals are also being reevaluated. Many older buildings weren't built with megathrust quakes in mind. In places like Chile and Indonesia, major hospital upgrades have started, so that emergency services don't collapse right when they're needed most. In the United States, California has already spent billions reinforcing hospitals to make sure they stay standing during a major quake. These upgrades are costly, but when disaster hits, they can be the difference between life and death for thousands. One challenge that's harder to fix is economic resilience. If a megathrust earthquake destroys a major port, it can stall the economy of an entire country. Take the Port of Los Angeles or the Port of Vancouver. Both handle huge amounts of cargo. If they go offline, it doesn't just affect the West Coast. It can delay supplies across the country. This is why disaster planning now includes alternative routes and backup transportation hubs to keep goods moving even if major ports are damaged. Another area being explored is how nature can help us. In some countries, engineers are working with natural defenses like coastal forests and wetlands to reduce the impact of tsunamis. These natural barriers can slow waves down and help protect inland areas. While they can't stop the damage completely, they can reduce it enough to save lives and property. People are also being taught what to do when the ground starts shaking. Emergency drills are now part of school routines in many earthquake-prone areas. Families are encouraged to have go bags ready, filled with water, food, first aid supplies, and important documents. Cities are running simulations that test how well their response plans actually work. The idea is to make sure that when the time comes, everyone knows what to do without having to stop and think. One of the biggest lessons from past megathrust earthquakes is that rebuilding takes time, years or even decades. Some areas in Japan are still recovering from the quake and tsunami that hit in the year 2011. It takes a long time to bring back roads, homes, businesses, and a sense of normal life. That's why planning for recovery is just as important as planning for the earthquake itself. Who will pay for the rebuilding? How can communities make sure they rebuild smarter and safer than before? And in the end, the next megathrust earthquake will not just test buildings and roads, it will test how well people can work together. From local leaders to national governments, from neighbors helping neighbors to scientists and engineers building better systems, every piece matters. There's no way to stop the next megathrust earthquake, but by preparing now, we can make sure we're ready to survive it and to recover afterward stronger than before. In an alternate reality, let's imagine what would have happened if Hurricane Katrina hit New York City instead of New Orleans. Hurricane Katrina, which made landfall in the Gulf Coast in August of 2005, was one of the most destructive natural disasters in United States history. New Orleans bore the brunt of its fury, but what if the storm had shifted east and directly struck the heart of New York City? The Big Apple, known for its iconic skyline, bustling streets, and dense population, would face a completely different set of challenges compared to New Orleans. New York City is home to over 8 million people, making it one of the most densely populated urban areas in the country. The sheer number of people would be a massive hurdle for evacuation. In the case of a storm like Katrina, people would need to leave the city quickly, but with so many residents, that would be incredibly difficult to manage. Highways, bridges, and tunnels would become clogged with traffic, and public transportation would be overwhelmed. The complexity of evacuating so many people would cause chaos, and not everyone would be able to leave in time. In addition to the challenge of evacuation, New York's infrastructure would face extreme stress. The city's subway system, which serves millions of commuters daily, would be at risk of flooding. The city's tall skyscrapers, which are a hallmark of its skyline, would also be tested by Katrina's intense winds. With wind speeds reaching over 170 miles per hour at its peak, these buildings could experience significant structural damage, and even windows could be shattered by flying debris. On the streets, residents would feel the effects of the storm surge. New York's coastal areas, including Lower Manhattan and parts of Brooklyn, would be especially vulnerable. The storm surge, a massive rise in sea level caused by the hurricane's strong winds, could flood these low-lying areas, including key parts of the city that are home to many of its most important buildings and businesses. As the storm surge hits, floodwaters could push into the subway tunnels and submerge underground stations, making it impossible for the transit system to function properly. The surrounding streets would quickly become rivers, turning daily life into a chaotic scene. Another challenge would be the city's unique geography. Unlike New Orleans, which sits below sea level, New York City's elevated areas could provide some protection from the initial storm surge. However, those high-rise buildings would act like wind tunnels, amplifying the storm's ferocity as gusts raced through narrow streets. The combination of flooding, strong winds, and the threat of falling debris would put immense pressure on the city's emergency response systems. The city's first responders, firefighters, police officers, and medical teams would be stretched thin, trying to save lives, restore order, and prevent further damage. Emergency shelters would be a necessity for thousands of displaced people. Given the scale of the disaster, setting up enough shelters for millions of residents would be a massive task. Relief efforts would need to be organized swiftly, and supplies such as food, water, and medical supplies would need to be distributed immediately. But with the entire city's infrastructure in chaos, delivering these essentials would be no easy task. In this early phase of the storm, New York City would be facing extreme weather conditions, rain pouring down relentlessly, wind howling through the streets, and the distinct sound of windows shattering as debris flew through the air. The immediate priority would be to secure people in place, offering shelter where possible, and then trying to get ahead of the floodwaters before they overtake the city. The city's residents would need to find safety wherever they could, whether it be in tall buildings or stronger, more secure structures. Evacuation plans would quickly shift into rescue operations, with emergency teams going door to door, searching for survivors in flooded homes or people trapped on the streets. As the storm approaches, New York would be preparing for the worst. It's not hard to imagine the chaos in this bustling city as it faced the might of Hurricane Katrina, one of the strongest hurricanes ever to make landfall in the United States. The stage would be set for a disaster of unprecedented scale, and the question on everyone's mind would be, how would New York City survive the storm? As Hurricane Katrina continues its approach toward New York City, the storm's full power would begin to make itself known. By now, the city would already be facing the initial brunt of the disaster: rain, wind, and rising waters. But the worst would still be to come. With winds sustained at over 170 miles per hour, and the storm surge pushing coastal waters to unprecedented levels, New York's low-lying neighborhoods would soon be overwhelmed. The financial district of Lower Manhattan, home to Wall Street and countless other key institutions, would be at the forefront of the damage. Flooding could reach several feet deep in these areas, submerging office buildings, residential, apartments, and underground utilities. Financial markets would be shut down, businesses would be forced to close, and any economic activity in the city would come to a standstill. Given New York's role as one of the world's major financial centers, the impact of this would ripple out across the global economy, with financial markets around the world reacting to the city's shutdown. As the storm surge pushes further into the city, the impact on transportation would be even more severe. New York's iconic bridges and tunnels, which help connect the boroughs, would become lifelines for evacuation, but they too would be put to the test. The bridges might remain intact, but flooding would make many of the tunnels impassable, further stranding people who had hoped to flee. Without the subway system, which typically transports millions of people every day getting anywhere, would be a monumental task. With streets already flooded, getting out of the city would become impossible for many. For the people left behind, navigating the storm would become an increasingly difficult and dangerous task. The strong winds would tear through the streets, toppling trees, light poles, and even buildings. Debris would be flying everywhere, creating dangerous conditions even for those who were trying to find shelter. The city's population, already under stress from flooding, would face an additional threat in the form of these flying hazards. Every street, every block would become a potential danger zone as winds gusted through, shattering glass and sending debris in all directions. The storm's flooding would affect more than just Lower Manhattan. Areas like Brooklyn and Queens, especially those near the waterfront, would experience significant water damage. While some parts of the city sit on higher ground, the sheer volume of water being pushed inland would make it difficult for even the most resilient parts of the city to avoid flooding. Residential areas along the rivers, such as those along the East River and the Hudson River, would see massive water inundation, potentially swallowing entire blocks. At the same time, power outages would be widespread. The storm's intensity would take down power lines, knocking out electricity to large sections of the city. In many cases, this would leave neighborhoods without basic services like lighting, refrigeration, and air conditioning. Without power, heat would become unbearable, and essential communications would be interrupted. Hospitals would struggle to maintain operations without backup power, and emergency services would find it difficult to coordinate without the use of radios, phones, or computers. In the midst of all this chaos, the city's emergency responders would face unimaginable challenges. With roads blocked and tunnels flooded, first responders would have to rely on boats, helicopters, and other specialized equipment to reach those in need. Search and rescue missions would be underway as emergency teams attempted to reach people trapped in flooded buildings, especially in high-rise apartments or homes along the water, while the city's fire departments, police, and medical teams would be doing their best to help. The sheer scale of the disaster would make it difficult to save everyone. At the same time, the psychological toll on New Yorkers would be profound. In a city known for its hustle and bustle, the sudden stillness of an evacuated or half-submerged city would create a surreal scene. People who had never seen their city this way, flooded, abandoned, and dark, would have to adjust to a new reality. As they huddled together in shelters waiting for the storm to pass, they would also wonder how they could possibly rebuild after such a devastating event. The emotional impact of Hurricane Katrina hitting New York would be felt far beyond the immediate destruction. It would redefine the city in ways no one could anticipate. By this point, the city's streets would be unrecognizable. The skyline, which had once stood as a symbol of New York's resilience and strength, would be obscured by dark clouds and swirling debris. Even if the winds started to subside, the damage done to buildings, infrastructure, and homes would be immense. With every new flash of lightning, the full extent of the destruction would be revealed. Roads torn up, buildings collapsed, and floodwaters inching higher. As New Yorkers braced themselves for the storm to pass, the real work of recovery would be just beginning. As Hurricane Katrina begins to move further inland, New York City would find itself facing the aftermath of one of the most destructive natural disasters in its history. The storm, which has already wreaked havoc on the city's infrastructure, would leave the city reeling with the daunting task of recovery. The first priority would be ensuring the safety of the city's residents. With many neighborhoods still submerged under floodwaters, the authorities would have to continue their efforts to rescue people from flooded buildings and evacuate those who are still trapped. The damage to the city's infrastructure would be catastrophic. Roads, bridges, and tunnels, essential for both evacuation and transportation, would have suffered severe damage from the storm's flooding and high winds. Major roads leading out of the city, like the FDR Drive in Manhattan and the Long Island Expressway in Queens, would be rendered impassable, with debris scattered across entire stretches of the highways. Even as waters begin to recede, the damage to the roadways would make travel impossible, further complicating the evacuation process. While the city's subway system typically serves millions of commuters each day, it would be particularly vulnerable to the flooding. With water pouring into the underground tunnels, the subway system could be rendered inoperable for weeks or even months, severely limiting the city's ability to function normally. The Metropolitan Transportation Authority would face a Herculean task to repair the extensive damage done to the system, and this would have a lasting impact on how New Yorkers travel throughout the city. For a city so dependent on its public transportation, this disruption would be a blow to its daily life. In addition to the damage to the transportation network, New York's iconic high-rise buildings would also suffer significant damage. Many of these buildings are constructed with glass facades, which would be easily shattered by the hurricane's fierce winds. The impact of the winds could cause windows to break and debris to fly through the air, creating dangerous conditions for those still on the streets. Some buildings, especially older structures or those located near the waterfront, may have sustained significant structural damage, and there would likely be widespread reports of fires breaking out due to the storm's effects on electrical systems. While efforts would be made to restore basic services, power outages would continue to affect large parts of the city. The loss of electricity would leave residents without air conditioning, street lighting, and other essential services for days or even longer. The city's hospitals, already stretched thin, would have to rely on backup power, which may not be sufficient to handle the influx of patients requiring urgent medical attention. It is likely that the healthcare system would be overwhelmed, and many residents would have to wait for days to receive necessary care. Another significant challenge would be the contamination of the city's water supply. With floodwaters mixing with sewage, chemicals, and other pollutants, the water supply would likely become unsafe to drink. Residents would need to rely on emergency water distribution centers set up by the authorities, but getting enough clean water to everyone in need would be an ongoing struggle. Sanitation would also become a concern, as the city's waste management systems would be disrupted, further complicating efforts to maintain public health. The city's economy, already facing the immediate aftermath of the storm, would be deeply affected in the long term. Major industries like finance, tourism, and retail would be severely disrupted. New York's financial markets, which were shut down during the storm, would likely remain closed for several days, if not weeks. The disruptions in the global financial system would ripple out, affecting economies worldwide. As businesses try to recover from the damage, it would take months or even years for many of them to return to normal operations. Even as the city rebuilds, the economic toll of the storm would be felt for a long time to come. The human cost of the disaster would also be felt in the loss of life. While the full scope of the casualties would not be known immediately, the number of people displaced from their homes and forced to seek shelter in overcrowded facilities would be staggering. Thousands of residents would lose their homes, and many would be left with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Finding shelter for such a large number of displaced people would be a monumental task. Emergency shelters would be established across the city, but space would be limited, and conditions in these shelters would be far from ideal. People would struggle to find basic necessities like food, clean water, and medical care, all while grappling with the emotional toll of losing their homes and possessions. The psychological effects of the storm would also be profound. For New Yorkers who had witnessed the storm's destruction firsthand, the emotional scars would last far longer than the physical damage to the city. Many residents would be dealing with post-traumatic stress, as well as the grief of losing loved ones or their homes. For many, the trauma of Hurricane Katrina hitting New York City would forever change how they view their city and their lives. The city's recovery would be a long and difficult process. The scale of the destruction would require an unprecedented effort to rebuild. Government officials, business leaders, and ordinary citizens would have to work together to restore the city to its former glory. The challenges of recovery would extend far beyond just rebuilding homes and businesses. New York would need to rethink its approach to infrastructure, disaster preparedness, and climate change, as the reality of living in a city that could be vulnerable to hurricanes would be impossible to ignore. Over time, the city would heal, but the scars left by Hurricane Katrina would forever be part of New York City's history. As New York City begins the daunting task of recovery, the focus would shift toward rebuilding the infrastructure and addressing the long-term impacts of Hurricane Katrina. The city's leadership, alongside state and federal officials, would work to coordinate relief and recovery efforts. While there would be a massive influx of resources, the process would take years, with many areas still struggling long after the immediate aftermath. One of the major concerns would be rebuilding the city's transportation system. The subway system, which had suffered extensive flooding, would require a complete overhaul. Many of the tunnels would need to be cleaned and repaired, and the electrical systems would need to be replaced. This process could take months or even years, and until then, the city's residents would have to find alternative means of transportation. Bus services would be increased, but with the subway out of commission, traffic congestion would worsen. Many commuters would likely opt for ride-sharing services, adding strain to the city's already congested roads. The rebuilding process would also extend to the city's utilities. Restoring electricity to the vast and densely populated boroughs of New York City would be a monumental task. Power outages would persist in some areas for weeks, especially in Lower Manhattan and parts of Brooklyn that were hit hardest by the flooding. The city would need to improve its electrical infrastructure to ensure future storms don't cause the same level of damage. A focus on reinforcing power grids and backup systems would be essential. An investment in renewable energy sources might become a higher priority to reduce the city's dependence on vulnerable power stations. In addition to the physical reconstruction, the psychological impact of the disaster would remain an ongoing challenge. New York's residents, many of whom had already lived through the trauma of the September 11th attacks in 2001, would find themselves grappling with a new layer of fear and uncertainty. Mental health services would become a critical part of the recovery process, with counseling and support available for those affected by the storm's devastation. Schools, churches, and community centers would become essential hubs for healing, providing residents with the support they needed as they processed their experiences. The economic fallout from the hurricane would be felt across every sector of New York City's economy. The tourism industry, one of the city's largest sources of revenue, would suffer as travelers canceled trips, fearing continued disruption. Hotels, restaurants, and entertainment venues would take a major hit, especially in the areas that had been most affected by flooding. Many businesses, particularly small ones, would face the difficult choice of whether to close their doors for good or attempt to rebuild. The unemployment rate would likely rise as businesses struggled to get back on their feet, and the city's workforce would face uncertainty as a result of the disaster's long-term impact on the economy. Insurance claims would pour in, but given the widespread damage across such a large and densely populated area, many insurance companies would struggle to cover the enormous costs. This could result in lengthy delays in compensation for homeowners and business owners, further exacerbating the financial strain felt by those affected by the storm. The government would step in to provide disaster relief, but the scale of the recovery effort would require sustained efforts from all levels of government. Amid all the destruction and rebuilding, the city would begin to rethink its approach to disaster preparedness. Hurricane Katrina's impact would leave a lasting legacy on the New York City's planning policies. The city would invest heavily in improving its flood control systems, building stronger seawalls and levees to protect against future storm surges. Zoning laws may also change to ensure that new construction is more resilient to flooding and high winds. Additionally, the city's emergency response plans would be overhauled, with a renewed focus on coordination and communication between different agencies to ensure a faster and more efficient response in future disasters. The storm would also spark a broader conversation about climate change and the role it played in the severity of Hurricane Katrina. The disaster's impact on New York City would likely lead to an increase in discussions about rising sea levels, stronger storms, and the need for long-term environmental sustainability. The city would work towards becoming more resilient to climate change, investing in green infrastructure and exploring innovative solutions for reducing its environmental footprint. In the years following the storm, New York City would begin to rebuild itself, but the scars of Hurricane Katrina would never fully fade. The disaster would serve as a reminder of the city's vulnerability to extreme weather events, and the recovery process would be a testament to the resilience of New Yorkers. With time, the city would return to its bustling, vibrant self, but the lessons learned from the storm would shape how it prepares for and responds to future challenges. Ultimately, New York City would recover, but Hurricane Katrina's impact would remain a part of its history. The storm would forever change how the city approaches disaster preparedness, urban planning, and its response to the growing threats posed by climate change. In the face of overwhelming destruction, the city's spirit would endure, and New Yorkers would continue to rebuild stronger and more determined than before. Let's imagine a different reality for a moment. This is a hypothetical, alternate history kind of scenario. What if Mount Vesuvius erupted today with the same fury it had back in the year 79 AD? What would that look like in our modern world? We all know that back then, the eruption buried entire Roman cities, like Pompeii and Herculaneum, under ash and volcanic debris. Thousands of people were killed in just a matter of hours. It's one of the most famous natural disasters in history. But now let's fast forward almost 2,000 years and picture what might happen if that exact same event took place right now. Mount Vesuvius is not some ancient relic. It's a very real and active volcano located in southern Italy, just a few miles from the city of Naples. And Naples is not a small town. It's home to more than 3 million people across its metro area. So if Vesuvius were to erupt the way it did in ancient times, it wouldn't be hitting remote ruins or scattered farms. It would be crashing right into one of the most densely populated regions in Europe. The danger isn't just theoretical either. Scientists have studied the volcano for years, and they know that it has erupted multiple times since 79 AD. In fact, the last eruption happened in the year 1944 during World War II. It wasn't as big as the one in ancient Rome, but it still caused plenty of damage. And ever since then, scientists have been keeping a very close eye on it. The Italian National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology runs a constant monitoring system around Vesuvius. They watch the ground for shifts, listen for tremors, and measure gas levels around the crater. It's one of the most closely watched volcanoes in the world. Still, all the monitoring in the world can't always predict exactly when or how a volcano will blow. If Vesuvius started showing serious signs of activity, it might give a few days or even weeks of warning. But in a worst-case scenario, there might only be hours to act. That means millions of people would have to evacuate very quickly, and that's where the real challenge begins. A lot of towns and cities are built right around the base of the volcano. These are places with homes, schools, hospitals, businesses, everyday life. Some of the people living there are in what's known as the red zone, the area expected to be hit hardest by things like pyroclastic flows, ashfall, and flying debris. In a full-force eruption like the one from the year 79 AD, those pyroclastic flows could race down the mountain at speeds of over 100 miles per hour, destroying everything in their path. Naples would be in the danger zone for heavy ashfall, which can collapse roofs, contaminate water supplies, and make it hard to breathe. If the wind were blowing in just the wrong direction, thick clouds of volcanic ash could smother entire neighborhoods in a matter of hours. Imagine walking outside and seeing the sky turn black in the middle of the day. That's what ancient Roman writings described back then, and the same thing could happen again. Even modern buildings and roads might not stand a chance. Airports would shut down, trains would stop running, and roads could become impossible to drive on because of all the ash and debris. People would panic, traffic would pile up, and emergency services would be overwhelmed trying to manage the chaos. And this is all just the beginning, and that's the reality we're stepping into with this hypothetical. In the next part, we'll take a deeper look at what the first 24 hours would look like during the eruption, how the eruption begins, how fast the situation unravels, and what happens to the people caught in the middle of it. The eruption begins without warning in the early morning hours. First, there's a deep rumble under the earth, followed by a sudden explosion that blasts a massive column of ash and gas into the sky. Within minutes, the top of Mount Vesuvius is hidden behind a cloud that stretches tens of thousands of feet high. Lightning crackles through the ash as the pressure from beneath the volcano is released in violent bursts. People across Naples and the surrounding towns wake up in confusion and fear. Windows rattle, dogs bark, and the ground trembles underfoot. In the first hour, the sky grows darker. The sun disappears behind the thick cloud, and a strange stillness falls over the city. Ash begins falling like snow, slowly at first, then thicker and heavier. Cars are soon covered, streets look like they've been blanketed in gray powder, and it becomes difficult to breathe without some kind of protection. The ash stings the eyes and burns the throat. Local news stations broadcast nonstop, telling people to stay inside if they haven't already evacuated. But it's already too late for many. Closer to the volcano, in towns like San Sebastiano al Vesuvio and Torre del Greco, everything happens fast. The ground splits open in places. Huge pieces of rock are launched from the crater like cannonballs, crashing into buildings and vehicles. Then come the pyroclastic surges, superheated clouds of gas, ash, and rock moving so fast there's no time to escape. These surges race down the slopes of the volcano, engulfing homes, roads, and anything standing in their path. Temperatures inside these clouds reach over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt metal. Anyone caught in them wouldn't survive. Hospitals begin to fill up quickly with people suffering from burns, breathing problems, and injuries from falling debris. But many doctors and nurses are stranded themselves, unable to reach work through the chaos. Cell service is patchy, power flickers in and out, emergency responders are working without rest, but the roads are jammed with traffic, and visibility is near zero in some areas due to the ash. Helicopters are grounded, boats try to help evacuate people along the coastline, but the sea is becoming rough as the eruption shakes the entire region. The Italian government activates its highest level emergency protocols. Military vehicles begin arriving to help transport people. Shelters in nearby cities like Salerno and Caserta are quickly filled, and more need to be opened in places farther north. Meanwhile, the ash cloud keeps rising. Air travel is shut down across southern Italy, and planes are rerouted away from large sections of Europe. The volcanic ash contains tiny particles of glass and rock that can destroy airplane engines, so Every flight near the area is grounded. By the end of the first day, it's estimated that tens of thousands of homes have been destroyed or seriously damaged. Entire towns are silent under layers of ash and debris. The death toll is unknown, but feared to be in the thousands. Rescue workers continue searching through the rubble, calling out for survivors, and trying to locate people who might be trapped. In other parts of Italy and even across Europe, people are glued to their screens, watching live footage of the eruption. It's not just a local crisis anymore, it's a national emergency, with international consequences. Scientists warn that if the eruption continues at this intensity, the effects could stretch far beyond Italy. The ash could enter the upper atmosphere, changing weather patterns and even cooling and global temperatures in the weeks ahead. As the first night falls, people are still trying to get out. The roads are lined with abandoned cars. Some people are walking, covering their faces with scarves and jackets, hoping to make it somewhere safe before the next blast comes. For many, the worst is still to come. In the next part, we'll take a closer look at the fallout during the first month after the eruption, what life looks like for survivors, what challenges Italy faces in rebuilding, and how the rest of the world is affected. In the weeks after the eruption, life across southern Italy changes completely. Naples, once a bustling coastal city full of life and movement, is now buried under layers of ash and broken stone. The air still smells like sulfur, and cleanup efforts are slow and dangerous. Thousands of people who escaped the initial disaster are now displaced, living in emergency shelters or with relatives in other parts of the country. Many homes are gone. Schools, churches, and businesses are shut down. Roads are either damaged or blocked with debris, making transportation difficult. Public health becomes a growing concern. With so much ash still in the air, people are told to wear protective masks at all times. Respiratory issues rise sharply. Hospitals outside the affected zone are overrun with patients from the south. Clean water is hard to come by in some areas because the ash has contaminated reservoirs. Crops in Campania, known for growing tomatoes, olives, and grapes, are destroyed. Farms that weren't buried are coated in fine volcanic dust, and livestock have either fled or perished. The Italian government declares a national disaster and calls for international aid. Help arrives from France, Germany, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Rescue teams, medical supplies, and cleanup equipment pour in. Engineers begin assessing the long-term damage to infrastructure, bridges, tunnels, and historic buildings. Some towns closer to the volcano are declared total losses. No one will return to live there anytime soon. Beyond Italy, the effects are spreading. The massive ash cloud has been slowly drifting across Europe. Satellite images show it stretching as far as parts of Scandinavia and Western Russia. Airports across the continent are facing delays and cancellations. Shipping routes in the Mediterranean are disrupted, forcing cargo vessels to reroute, raising the cost of goods. In cities like Rome, Milan, and Paris, daily life has changed as people adjust to hazy skies and ash warnings. Climate experts begin to raise alarms. With so much ash and sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere, there is concern about temporary cooling. Scientists compare it to what happened after the eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines in the early 1990s, when global temperatures dropped slightly for over a year. It's still too early to know how big the impact will be this time, but computer models suggest a cooler winter ahead for much of Europe and parts of Asia. In southern Italy, tensions are rising. Not everyone is happy with the speed of the government's response. Some communities feel abandoned, especially smaller towns on the edges of the disaster zone. Protests start popping up in nearby cities where displaced families are demanding more support, faster aid, and clearer answers about when they can go home or if they ever can. Emotional fatigue is setting in. Many people are grieving not just lost loved ones, but lost homes, lost routines, and lost futures. Cultural institutions begin their own recovery efforts. Museums and archaeological sites across Italy launch campaigns to save historic artifacts that may have been damaged by falling ash or tremors. Experts from around the world arrive to help preserve churches, ancient statues, and artwork threatened by the disaster. Meanwhile, volcanologists are still studying Mount Vesuvius closely. Small tremors continue to shake the region. Though the main eruption has passed, the volcano is not quiet yet. There are still gas emissions, minor explosions, and a high risk of landslides, as loose ash and rock shift in the rain. Scientists warn that secondary eruptions or mud flows, called lahars, could still hit nearby valleys and low-lying towns. The next challenge is rebuilding. But with ash piled in the streets, destroyed water systems, and power grids still down in some areas, recovery is slow and uncertain. As we move into the fourth and final part, we'll look at what happens a full year later. What has changed, what hasn't, and how this one disaster altered the lives of millions and left its mark far beyond Italy. 1 full year has passed since Mount Vesuvius erupted with the same force it did back in the year 79. The smoke has cleared, the skies have returned to a soft blue, and the constant tremors have quieted. But in southern Italy, the scars left behind are everywhere. What used to be thriving communities in the shadow of the volcano are now quiet zones of rubble, fenced off and still unsafe. The once vibrant slopes of the volcano are now dry, cracked, and coated in dark ash, with only small patches of new green trying to break through. In the city of Naples, the rebuilding process is slow and uneven. Wealthier districts have made progress. Roads have reopened and businesses are starting to come back to life. But poorer neighborhoods, especially those closer to the old eruption zone, still struggle. Whole blocks remain unlivable. Some residents have decided never to return, choosing instead to rebuild their lives in Rome or abroad. Others stay, holding on to hope that help will eventually reach them. Tourism, which was once a major source of income for the region, has not yet recovered. The famous ruins of Pompeii and Herculaneum, already delicate, suffered additional damage from falling ash and tremors during the eruption. Some historic buildings and roads leading to them are still closed. Tourists are hesitant, and local guides and shop owners have been out of work for many months. Hotels that once thrived during summer seasons are either shuttered or operating at half capacity. The environmental impact has started to shift. Some forests that were burned or buried are beginning to grow back. Rivers that had been clogged with ash and debris have cleared out with the help of teams of engineers and natural rainfall. However, the land around the volcano remains unstable. Farmers returning to check on their land are finding that their soil is still too dry or too acidic for planting. Vineyards that once produced prized regional wines may take years to recover, if they do at all. Across Europe, the lasting effects of the ash cloud are still felt. While the skies cleared months ago, the unusual cooling that followed the eruption had an effect on agriculture. Crops in parts of France, Germany, and Eastern Europe produced lower yields during the last harvest season. Some regions experienced an unusually cold winter, especially in northern areas. The global climate impact wasn't as severe as feared, but scientists are still studying long-term changes. Economically, Italy is under pressure. Billions of euros have already been spent on emergency aid, rebuilding, and infrastructure. International support helped during the early weeks, but now the burden lies mostly on Italy's shoulders. Insurance claims, government loans, and public projects are draining funds quickly. Some smaller towns have been quietly written off, marked as uninhabitable for the foreseeable future, their residents permanently relocated. On a human level, the emotional toll remains heavy. Mental health services have seen a sharp increase in demand. People who survived the eruption now face anxiety, grief, and a sense of loss that can't easily be fixed. Children who lived through the evacuation are still adjusting to life in temporary schools. Entire families have been split up by relocation. Communities that once held tight bonds are now scattered. At the same time, some powerful lessons have been learned. Emergency systems are being redesigned across the country, not just in Naples. Early warning systems, communication networks, and evacuation routes have all been updated using the latest technology. The eruption served as a wake-up call not just for Italy, but for every country with active volcanoes. Volcanologists, city planners, and government leaders around the world are reviewing their plans and preparing for the worst. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in the modern day changed everything. It reminded the world that nature, no matter how carefully we monitor it, still holds incredible power. It destroyed lives, homes, and history, but it also sparked a global conversation about readiness, resilience, and the importance of respecting the natural forces around us. This disaster may be behind us, but the lessons it left will shape the future for years to come. Imagine if the Ice Age just never happened. No mile-thick glaciers slowly creeping across North America. No frozen tundras covering northern Europe. No massive ice sheets shaping the land we know today. It's a pretty wild thought, but let's think about it. The last major ice age, also known as the last glacial maximum, peaked around 20,000 years ago. At that time, giant ice sheets stretched all the way down into what's now the northern United States. But what if none of that ice ever formed in the first place? To start off, the most obvious thing is the temperature. Without the Ice Age, the Earth would have stayed much warmer overall. That means polar regions like Greenland and Antarctica might never have developed their thick ice caps. Instead of being icy wastelands, they could be covered in forests, grasslands, or even full ecosystems that we usually only see in temperate zones. Arctic wildlife as we know it, polar bears, Arctic foxes, seals, might not exist at all. Their cold climate niches wouldn't be around, so they probably never would have evolved in the first place. Sea levels would also be completely different. During the last ice age, sea levels were over 300 feet lower than they are today because so much of the Earth's water was trapped in ice. If there had never been an ice age, all that water would have stayed in the oceans. That means the coastlines would be farther inland, and entire parts of the world we live on today would be underwater. Places like Florida, the Netherlands, Bangladesh, and even parts of New York City might just be gone. Coastal cities wouldn't exist as we know them. The shape of the land would be different too. Ice is heavy. When glaciers push across the land, they scrape and flatten the surface beneath them, carving valleys, shaping hills, and creating lakes. The Great Lakes in North America, those were carved out by glaciers. No ice age, no Great Lakes. Norway's deep fjords carved by glaciers over time would look totally different or maybe wouldn't even be there. A huge portion of the world's iconic landscapes were created by the movement of ice. Without it, Earth might look a lot smoother and maybe even less dramatic in some regions. And then there's the question of how life would have evolved. Ice ages didn't just change the land, they shaped life too. They forced animals and plants to migrate, adapt, or die off. In turn, that pushed evolution in new directions. For humans, it meant developing tools, shelters, and clothing to survive harsh winters. Without that kind of challenge, early humans might have had a totally different path. We might not have spread out across the globe the same way. Maybe certain populations would have stayed where it was warm and never moved north. That could have changed everything from cultures to languages to the entire timeline of human history. That's just scratching the surface of how different things might have been. The world without the Ice Age would be warmer, wetter, and possibly way less recognizable. And that's only the beginning. In the next part, we'll get into some of the scientific debates about whether the Ice Age happened exactly the way we think it did, or if some of the evidence might actually point to something else entirely. Now that we've pictured a world without the Ice Age, let's talk about something that makes this whole idea even more interesting. There's actually a debate among scientists, not about whether the Earth was cold at times, but about how much ice really shaped the planet. Some researchers fully support the classic idea that massive ice sheets rolled over continents and left behind all sorts of physical evidence, but others say, hold on, maybe we're not seeing the full picture. A big part of the traditional Ice Age story comes from landforms. Geologists look at things like U-shaped valleys, drumlins, and moraines. These are land features believed to be shaped by glaciers. They also point to glacial erratics, which are giant rocks found far from their original location, supposedly carried there by ice. But some scientists argue that water, not ice, could have done that too. In places like eastern Washington, there's a theory that catastrophic floods created some of the features we thought were caused by glaciers. The landscape, known as the channeled scablands, was once believed to be carved slowly by ice, but now we know it formed almost overnight from a massive flood caused by a bursting glacial lake. Then there's the ice core data, long cylinders of ice drilled from Antarctica and Greenland. These cores contain layers that trap tiny bits of ancient air, showing things like carbon dioxide levels and temperature shifts. They're like time capsules of Earth's climate. But here's where it gets tricky. Interpreting those layers isn't always straightforward. Some scientists question whether changes in the layers were caused by cold, icy climates or by other forces like volcanic activity, shifting ocean currents or solar cycles. It's not that the cores are wrong, it's just that they might not tell the whole story on their own. And let's not forget tectonic activity. Earth's surface is constantly moving. Mountains rise, oceans spread, and entire continents shift around. Some researchers say that tectonic forces could have caused a lot of the same features we credit to glaciers. For example, if a valley looks like it was carved by ice, could it actually have been formed by fault movement or erosion over millions of years? The idea here isn't that ice ages never happened, it's more that they might not have happened exactly the way we've been told. Science is always evolving, and as new tools and data come in, old theories get challenged. Even textbooks have changed over time. What was accepted in the 1970s might be totally different from what we think now. So when we talk about a world without an ice age, it opens the door to more than just a what-if scenario. It invites us to question how much of what we think we know about Earth's past is solid, and how much is still up for debate. In the next part, we'll take this further and look at how life, not just landscapes, could have taken completely different paths if the cold never came. If the Ice Age never happened, it wouldn't just change the shape of the land, it would completely change the way life evolved, including human life. The cold climate forced animals and early humans to adapt in ways that helped shape modern species. Without that push for survival in harsh, icy environments, evolution might have taken a totally different path. For example, many large mammals we know today, like woolly mammoths, saber-toothed cats, and giant ground sloths, were specially adapted for the Ice Age. They had thick fur, large bodies to conserve heat, and diets suited for the colder environments. Without an Ice Age, these animals might have never existed at all. Instead, the planet might have stayed dominated by species better suited for warmer climates, possibly more reptiles, insects, or jungle-adapted mammals. The colder regions wouldn't have developed the tundras and boreal forests we see now, and the ecosystems would have been completely different. Now think about humans. Our ancestors had to survive through extreme conditions during the last Ice Age, which peaked around 20,000 years ago. That meant building shelters, creating clothing, using fire effectively, and working together in small groups. All of that helped develop early tools, language, and even social systems. Without those challenges, maybe early humans wouldn't have had the same reasons to innovate so quickly. We might not have spread across the globe the same way. Migration routes were shaped by glacial coverage. When sea levels dropped because of the frozen water, it exposed land bridges like the one between Asia and North America. If the Ice Age never happened, many of those paths wouldn't have existed, and entire continents might have remained unpopulated for much longer. Agriculture also would have been affected. After the Ice Age ended, temperatures stabilized and large areas of land became perfect for farming. That shift, known as the Neolithic Revolution, changed everything. People stopped hunting and gathering and started planting crops, which led to villages, cities, and civilizations. Without the end of the Ice Age creating those fertile plains, farming might have started much later, or maybe not at all in some parts of the world. The Earth's climate also influences disease. Cold, dry environments help preserve bodies, but warmer, wetter ones allow bacteria and viruses to spread faster. In a world without an Ice Age, global health history might look a lot different. Some of the diseases that wiped out ancient populations could have evolved sooner or spread more quickly. In short, without that global freeze, the world would probably be greener and wetter, but maybe less advanced in terms of human development. We'd still be here, but who knows what we'd look like, how we'd live, or what kind of creatures we'd share the planet with. And that brings us to the final part, where we'll explore what the environment and modern world might be like today if the Ice Age never came. So what would the modern world actually look like if the Ice Age never happened? Well, to start with, coastlines would be completely different. During the Ice Age, so much water was trapped in glaciers that sea levels dropped by over 300 feet. When the glaciers melted, that water flowed back into the oceans, raising sea levels and flooding coastlines. Without that process, a lot more land would still be exposed today. Places that are underwater now, like parts of the North Sea or the Bering Strait, might still be dry land, connecting continents and creating entirely different maps. The weather patterns would also be nothing like what we know. Ice ages help regulate Earth's long-term climate by pushing cold air toward the equator and creating stable seasonal changes. Without that massive freeze and thaw cycle, weather systems might be more extreme and unpredictable. We could be looking at hotter tropics stretching further north and south, with fewer areas that experience regular seasons. The polar regions might still be chilly but not nearly as icy, which would mean less reflection of sunlight back into space. That change in sunlight absorption could have made Earth warmer overall. Glaciers also play a big role in shaping rivers and lakes. A lot of the world's most important freshwater sources, like the Great Lakes in North America or many rivers in Europe, were carved out by glaciers. If those glaciers never existed, it's possible that many of our freshwater supplies would be smaller or not there at all. That could have changed where people settled, which cities were built, and how civilizations grew over time. Even mineral resources would be different. Glacial movements helped scrape and expose metal-rich rock formations, making it easier for humans to mine things like iron, copper, and gold. Without glaciers doing that work, early societies might have had a harder time accessing those materials, which could have slowed down the development of tools, buildings, and trade. Modern agriculture would be another major difference. The melting of glaciers after the Ice Age left behind nutrient-rich soil, perfect for growing crops. Without that, much of the land we now use for farming might have been less productive. Countries that depend on agriculture today might have looked completely different or struggled to develop large-scale farming at all. Finally, tourism, sports, and recreation tied to snow and ice, like skiing, snowboarding, or glacier hikes, probably wouldn't even exist. Some of the world's most visited natural wonders, like Norway's fjords or the glaciers in Alaska and Patagonia, wouldn't have formed at all. Landscapes would be smoother, flatter, and maybe less dramatic. So, yeah, if the Ice Age never happened, we'd be living on a very different planet. The land, the weather, the animals, even human life would all have taken a different path. It's wild to think that a few degrees of global cooling thousands of years ago ended up shaping almost everything we see around us today. Yeah. Thanks for sticking around for this thought experiment. If you're into more mind-bending stuff like this, check out our playlist on hypothetical scenarios. Imagine waking up tomorrow and finding out that the world is now 10 degrees Celsius hotter than it was yesterday, and that this new temperature isn't going away. That's not just a bad heat wave or a freak summer. This would be a total transformation of Earth's climate permanently, and it wouldn't take long for everything around us to start changing in ways most of us can't even imagine. A jump of 10 degrees globally might not sound huge at first, but this kind of rise would make many places on Earth completely unlivable almost immediately. The hottest parts of the world, like the Middle East, parts of Africa, and South Asia, would become so hot that just going outside for more than a few minutes could be deadly. Cities that already deal with extreme heat, like Kuwait City or Delhi, would face heat levels beyond what the human body can survive for long. It's not just about personal comfort either. It's about how this level of heat would break the systems we rely on. Roads and train tracks would warp. Power grids would struggle to keep up with the demand for air conditioning. In many places, blackouts would become common as everyone tried to escape the heat, putting more pressure on aging infrastructure. Planes might not be able to take off in the hottest areas because high temperatures make the air thinner and reduce lift. Now think about the Arctic and Antarctic. These frozen regions would melt at an unprecedented speed. Greenland's entire ice sheet, which holds enough ice to raise global sea levels by over 6 meters, would melt into the oceans. The same goes for parts of Antarctica, and when that happens, coastlines across the world would start disappearing. Cities like Miami, Jakarta, and Venice could be underwater or turned into swamps full of salt water. But sea level rise is just part of it. The ocean itself would change. Coral reefs would die almost everywhere. They've already been suffering under smaller temperature rises, but with 10 degrees added, the oceans would be way too warm for coral to survive. These reefs are home to a massive portion of marine life, so losing them would send shock waves through the food chain, from tiny fish all the way to sharks and whales, and we'd lose more than just sea life. On land, massive forests like the Amazon rainforest would start to dry out and catch fire. The Amazon helps cool the earth and produces a lot of the oxygen we breathe, but with temperatures staying this high forever, it would shift from being a tropical rainforest to a dry savanna, or even a desert in some places. That kind of transformation would release billions of tons of carbon back into the air, making the climate problem even worse. These aren't slow, distant effects either. Some of these changes would begin within the first few years, others would unfold over decades, but once they start, they'd be very hard, maybe even impossible to stop. In the next part, we'll look at how these rising temperatures would lead to non-stop disasters like mega droughts, unstoppable wildfires, and more destructive hurricanes. Events that would become part of everyday life. With a permanent global rise of 10 degrees Celsius, the weather would no longer feel random or seasonal. It would feel like chaos. Dangerous storms, once rare, would start happening all the time. Heat doesn't just make days uncomfortable, it powers the atmosphere, turning normal weather into something violent and destructive. Hurricanes, for example, feed off warm ocean water. With oceans much hotter than ever before, hurricanes would become bigger, stronger, and more frequent. We're not just talking about Category 4 or 5 storms. We'd start seeing storms that go beyond the current scale, tearing apart coastlines and flooding entire regions. Places that rarely dealt with hurricanes before, like parts of Europe or South America, might start facing regular landfalls. At the same time, long-lasting droughts would begin to spread across continents. Regions that already depend on seasonal rain, like Central Africa, Southern Asia, and the American Southwest, would begin drying out completely. Rivers like the Nile, the Indus, and the Colorado could shrink so much that they'd no longer reach the sea. That would be devastating for the hundreds of millions of people who rely on those rivers for farming, drinking water, and basic survival. Without rain and with intense heat baking the land, wildfires would explode in size and frequency. Forests wouldn't just burn once a year, they could burn several times in a decade. Even rainforests, which normally stay damp, would become dry enough to catch fire. These fires wouldn't just destroy trees, they'd wipe out entire ecosystems, fill the air with smoke, and send harmful gases into the sky, which would make the air even hotter and more dangerous to breathe. With extreme droughts and constant fires, food production would begin to crash. Crops like wheat, rice, and corn don't grow well in extreme heat, and farms would struggle to get enough water. Farming regions like the American Midwest, India's plains, and China's rice belt would face serious losses. Even countries that currently export food would find it hard to feed their own people. This would lead to food shortages, price spikes, and fights over limited resources. But it's not just food that would be in trouble. Water itself would become harder and harder to find. Lakes and reservoirs would dry up. Glaciers that normally feed rivers, like those in the Himalayas and the Andes, would melt away and stop providing water during dry seasons. Desalination, the process of turning seawater into fresh water, is an option, but it uses a lot of energy, and many of the regions that need it most wouldn't have the infrastructure or money to scale it up fast enough. The heat would also cause strange, unpredictable changes in rainfall patterns. Some places would go years without proper rain, while others would get hit with sudden massive downpours that cause flash floods. Cities with poor drainage systems like Lagos or Manila could see streets turn into rivers overnight. These extreme shifts from dry to wet and back again would wreck buildings, ruin crops, and make planning for the future nearly impossible. This constant cycle of destruction, storms, fires, droughts, and floods, would put enormous pressure on countries to respond. Emergency services would be overwhelmed, insurance companies might stop covering disasters altogether, and people living in areas hit over and over would start moving, setting off the largest climate migrations in human history. In the next part, we'll look at what happens when huge parts of the Earth become uninhabitable and how that could change the global map forever. If the planet warmed by 10 degrees Celsius and stayed that way, it wouldn't just make life uncomfortable, it would make entire regions completely unlivable. The hottest parts of the world, like the Middle East, Northern Africa, and parts of South Asia, would experience daily temperatures well above 50 degrees Celsius. That kind of heat is not just dangerous, it's deadly, especially in places without widespread access to the air conditioning or reliable infrastructure. At those temperatures, the human body struggles to cool itself. In humid areas where sweat can't evaporate quickly, even healthy people sitting in the shade could suffer heat stroke within hours. Hospitals would fill up with cases of dehydration and heat-related illnesses, but many health systems wouldn't be able to keep up. Power outages, already common during heat waves, would become even more dangerous, as people lost access to cooling systems when they needed them most. And it wouldn't stop at just making people sick. Entire cities would become too hot for humans to live in. Places like Phoenix, Baghdad, and New Delhi might need to be abandoned during the hottest months. Airports would struggle to function, roads would soften and crack, and buildings would warp from the constant heat. In many places, basic infrastructure like electricity, water systems, and transportation would fail under the strain. Millions, possibly billions of people would be forced to move. This would lead to one of the largest and fastest migrations in human history. People would flee to cooler regions like Northern Europe, Canada, and parts of Russia, but those places wouldn't be prepared for a sudden population surge. Housing, healthcare, and job markets would be pushed beyond their limits, leading to overcrowded cities, rising tensions, and possible conflict over resources. Meanwhile, countries that couldn't absorb the migrants would start closing their borders, leading to political instability. Nations might fight over fresh water supplies, farmland, and access to cooler zones. Internal displacement would also become a huge issue, with people moving from one part of a country to another, causing local economies to collapse and governments to struggle with maintaining order. At the same time, the natural world would continue to suffer. Ecosystems that once helped cool the planet would begin to collapse. Forests in the Amazon and Congo regions would dry out and turn into savannas. Wetlands would disappear. Even polar regions, once frozen year-round, would become warmer and more unstable, releasing even more greenhouse gases from melting permafrost. The combined impact on biodiversity would be devastating. Animals and plants that cannot migrate or adapt quickly enough would vanish. Pollinators like bees would decline. affecting food production even further. Coral reefs, already struggling with ocean warming and acidification, would vanish completely, wiping out entire marine ecosystems. It's important to realize that these changes wouldn't be spaced out over centuries. They could happen within just a few decades. In the next part, we'll explore how governments, science, and technology might try to respond to such a massive crisis, and whether there's any way to turn things around in a world that has already passed the point of no return. In a world that's permanently 10 degrees Celsius hotter, the question becomes, what, if anything, can humanity do to survive? At this point, it's no longer about stopping climate change. It's about adapting fast enough to stay alive. That means completely transforming how we live, build, grow food, and even govern. One of the biggest challenges would be keeping people fed. Traditional farming methods would collapse in many regions. Crops like wheat, corn, and rice wouldn't survive the heat, especially in places that already struggle with drought. Farmers would have to shift to heat-tolerant varieties or even move agriculture indoors using vertical farms and hydroponics. This kind of farming needs energy, water, and high-tech systems, which not every country would be able to afford or manage. Water would be just as critical. With rivers drying up and glaciers gone, new sources of fresh water would be needed. Desalination plants could become more common, especially in coastal areas, but they require huge amounts of energy. Recycling wastewater might also become standard in many cities, and rainwater collection could be essential in areas where rainfall still happens. Energy use would skyrocket, as people rely on cooling systems to survive, but at the same time, fossil fuel use would need to be phased out completely. That means a massive global shift to solar, wind, geothermal, and nuclear energy, all while trying to build power grids that can handle unpredictable demand and extreme conditions. Batteries and energy storage would have to be upgraded to store power during blackouts or storms. Architecture and city planning would also need to change. Cities would be rebuilt with reflective materials, more shaded areas, and greenery to reduce urban heat. Entire neighborhoods might move underground or be built with climate control in mind. Roads, railways, and bridges would need to be made with materials that can withstand extreme heat without warping or melting. At the global level, governments would be under constant pressure to maintain stability. Climate refugees would still be on the move, and international cooperation would be more important than ever. Alliances would form not just around politics, but around climate survival. Wealthy nations might be expected to help fund adaptation in poorer countries to prevent total collapse. This could lead to new global agreements or massive tensions if countries refuse to help one another. Technology would play a major role too. Geoengineering, once considered too risky, could become a last resort. Ideas like spraying aerosols into the upper atmosphere to reflect sunlight or creating artificial clouds might be tested, but these are unpredictable solutions, and many scientists warn they could have unintended side effects, possibly even making some regions drier or colder than before. Mental health would be a growing concern. Living in a world constantly on the edge, facing resource shortages, deadly heat, and climate disasters would take a toll. Communities would need strong support systems, and education would have to include not just science and survival skills, but also emotional resilience. In the end, surviving a 10-degree Celsius temperature rise would require the biggest transformation in human history. It would mean rethinking everything from the ground up. While it's hard to imagine such a world, scientists say we still have a small window to prevent it, but that window is closing fast. What happens next depends on what humanity chooses to do right now. Did you know that more than 70% of Earth's surface is covered by the ocean? Now imagine waking up one morning and it's just gone. Not a drop left. No waves, no tides. Just empty, dry seabeds stretching for miles where water used to be. If every drop of ocean water disappeared overnight, it wouldn't just be shocking. It would be the beginning of the most dramatic transformation Earth has ever seen. Right away, the ocean floor would be exposed. Trillions of tons of mud, coral, trenches, and ancient volcanic ridges now sitting under direct sunlight. You'd see massive canyons deeper than the Grand Canyon, thousands of shipwrecks, forgotten underwater cables, and possibly things we've never even discovered. The deepest parts of the ocean, like the Mariana Trench, would now be visible to the human eye, but there would be no time to admire the view because things would fall apart fast. The sudden removal of that much water would create an enormous shift in pressure across the planet. Our crust would begin to creak and shift without the weight of the water pressing down. Coastal shelves that were used to holding that weight might rise, while land in other areas could collapse inward. Earthquakes and volcanic eruptions would become more common, especially along the Ring of Fire in the Pacific. In places like Indonesia, Japan, and California, the risk of tectonic activity would skyrocket. Now let's talk about gravity for a second. The ocean isn't just big, it's heavy. All that water helps balance the planet. Without it, Earth's rotation might wobble slightly. It may not sound like a big deal, but over time, that small change could affect how long our days are and mess with seasonal patterns. It could even slightly shift the way Earth tilts on its axis, changing how sunlight hits different parts of the globe. Temperature is another huge issue. The ocean acts like a massive air conditioner for Earth. It absorbs heat from the sun during the day and slowly releases it at night, keeping temperatures stable. Without that, we'd start to see wild temperature swings. Daytime temperatures in many places could soar to record highs, while nights might become freezing. Think deserts, but everywhere. The areas that used to be near the coast would experience the most dramatic changes. Cities like San Francisco, Rio de Janeiro, and Cape Town could go from having mild weather to dealing with extreme heat during the day and bitter cold at night. And then there's the wind. Believe it or not, the ocean plays a big role in global wind patterns. It helps power massive systems like the jet stream and ocean currents like the Gulf Stream. Without those, weather patterns would change almost instantly. Storms would form in strange places, some areas would face non-stop drought, and others could get hit by powerful wind systems they've never dealt with before. Even the air would start to feel different. The ocean adds a ton of moisture to the atmosphere. Without it, the air in most places would become bone dry. Rainfall would stop in regions that rely on moisture from the ocean, and crops would start to fail. In some parts of the world, rivers would dry up because they depend on rainfall that comes from evaporated seawater. And one more strange thing, sea level would technically disappear, so our global reference for height and elevation would get reset. Everything from GPS systems to maps to construction planning would be thrown into chaos. Elevation signs on highways would no longer be accurate. Even airports and planes that use sea level as a base for flight data would have to completely update their systems. This is just the beginning. With no ocean left, we're looking at a chain reaction of problems that would touch every single part of life on Earth. And in the next part, we'll talk about what would happen to marine life and how entire ecosystems would collapse almost immediately. With the ocean gone, one of the first and most heartbreaking effects would be the complete loss of marine life. Everything from tiny plankton to massive whales would die out almost instantly. Without water, fish wouldn't survive for more than a few minutes. Coral reefs, which are already struggling today, would dry up and turn into chalky skeletons. Creatures that lived in the darkest parts of the deep sea would be exposed to sunlight for the first time, and their fragile bodies would not survive. This sudden extinction wouldn't just affect sea creatures. Entire food chains would fall apart. Seabirds that rely on fish would starve. Polar bears and seals, which depend on ice and ocean hunting grounds, would have nothing left, and it wouldn't stop with animals. The ocean also plays a massive role in feeding humans. Over 3 billion people today rely on seafood as their main source of protein. That food source would vanish overnight, causing global food shortages, especially in coastal countries and island nations. Then there's the fishing industry, which employs hundreds of millions of people around the world. In countries like Norway, Japan, Peru, and Indonesia, entire communities are built around the ocean. Without it, those jobs would disappear in a flash. The economic hit wouldn't be small. It would collapse entire industries. From seafood processing plants to boat-making companies and international shipping ports, the ripple effects would be massive. Tourism would also take a major hit. People love going to beaches, snorkeling in reefs, whale watching, and surfing. All of that would be gone. Beach towns that rely on tourism dollars, places like Bali, the Bahamas, and the coast of Spain, would become ghost towns. Hotels, restaurants, and tour companies would shut down, and the people who work in those industries would be left without jobs. The global economy would take a huge blow, especially in countries where ocean tourism is a major part of their income. But it's not just about jobs and food. The ocean is also one of the world's biggest pharmacies. Many medicines come from marine life, including treatments for cancer, infections, and pain. Some scientists believe we've only discovered a small percent of what the ocean can offer in terms of medical breakthroughs. Losing the ocean would mean losing all those possibilities, along with the chance to discover future cures hidden in the deep. On top of that, we'd lose one of our strongest defenses against disease. Coastal wetlands and mangroves, which grow near the ocean, act like natural filters. They trap harmful bacteria and prevent diseases from spreading inland. Without the ocean, these natural filters would die out, making it easier for illnesses to spread through dirty water and damage ecosystems. Even inland ecosystems would feel the impact. Rivers and lakes that connect to the ocean would see massive changes in water flow. Some could dry up, while others might flood. Plants and animals that depend on steady water levels would be thrown into chaos. Species would either migrate, adapt, or go extinct. And while the environment crashes, human society would begin to feel the pressure in every possible way. Food insecurity, job loss, and failing industries would all pile on fast. In many places, especially poorer countries, this could lead to protests, migration, and even conflicts over resources. With less food and fewer jobs, people would start moving inland, overwhelming cities that weren't built to handle huge population increases. This kind of crisis would not just affect one region, it would spread worldwide. In the next part, we'll dive into what happens to Earth's climate and weather when there's no ocean left to help balance it all out. Things would change fast, and not in a good way. Without the ocean, Earth's climate would start falling apart faster than most people could imagine. One of the biggest things the ocean does is move heat around the planet. It acts like a giant sponge, soaking up sunlight and helping to keep temperatures balanced between the equator and the poles. If all that water suddenly disappeared, there would be nothing left to absorb that heat. Places near the equator would become unbelievably hot, while colder areas might freeze even more than usual. Ocean currents, like the Gulf Stream, move warm water from the tropics up toward places like Europe and North America. These currents help regulate seasons, rain patterns, and even wind systems. Without them, entire continents would start to feel the change. Western Europe, which usually has mild winters because of the ocean's influence, would face brutal cold spells. Meanwhile, tropical areas would start to feel like ovens, and deserts could spread into places that used to be green and full of life. Rainfall patterns would also be thrown off completely. The ocean is a major source of the moisture that becomes rain. Without it, many parts of the world would dry out. Places like the Amazon rainforest, which depends on regular rainfall, could wither away. On the flip side, areas that already get too much rain could flood even worse. As strange weather patterns take over, it would become almost impossible to predict the weather anymore. Storms would act differently too. Right now, hurricanes form over warm ocean waters. Without the sea, those storms would no longer exist. That might sound like a good thing, but it's not that simple. Instead of hurricanes, we could start seeing new types of storms. With the atmosphere out of balance and no ocean to cool it down, powerful windstorms could rip through inland areas. Dust storms, heat waves, and sudden cold snaps could become the new normal. Some areas would become so dry they'd burn more easily, leading to more wildfires. Others would see thick fogs and strange shifts in pressure that damage buildings and roads over time. And then there's sea level. You'd think sea level wouldn't matter anymore if there's no ocean, but the sudden shift in pressure and gravity across the planet would cause the land itself to move in strange ways. Places that were once at sea level might sink or crack. Old coastlines would be full of shipwrecks, dried coral, and strange seabeds that used to be underwater for millions of years. Huge trenches and ridges would now be visible from space, creating a totally different map of the world. The air we breathe would also change. Right now, ocean plants like phytoplankton produce nearly half of the oxygen in the atmosphere. If they die, the amount of breathable oxygen could start to drop slowly. People with breathing problems would feel it first, but over time it would become an issue for everyone. Cities might need to install massive oxygen machines just to help people live normally. And without the ocean pulling carbon dioxide out of the air, that gas would build up fast, making the planet heat up even more. Even the seasons would start to feel strange. Winters might come later or earlier. Summers could be longer, drier, and more dangerous. Spring and fall might get shorter or disappear altogether. Animals that depend on regular seasons for migration or hibernation would be confused. They might start breeding at the wrong time or move to areas where they can't survive. Entire species could vanish just because the calendar no longer makes sense. As we continue, we'll explore what daily life might look like in this new version of Earth, how people might try to adapt, and what kind of world we'd be left with if the ocean stayed gone forever. In a world where the ocean no longer exists, daily life would become almost unrecognizable. The disappearance of such a massive body of water would completely change how people live, work, and survive. For starters, entire cities that once thrived along coastlines would be abandoned. With no ports, no beaches, and no water, there would be no reason for people to stay in places like San Francisco, Sydney, or Cape Town. These once busy coastal cities would turn into quiet ghost towns filled with empty buildings and cracked seabeds stretching for miles. Food would be one of the biggest concerns. With the ocean gone, seafood would vanish completely. Billions of people depend on fish and other marine animals for their protein. Losing that food source overnight would put enormous pressure on farms and livestock around the world. People would need to turn to alternative proteins like lab-grown meat or plant-based diets just to avoid widespread hunger. But even farming on land would be harder, since many farms near the coast rely on ocean moisture and stable weather. Without the ocean, crops could fail more often and prices would skyrocket. Transportation would also look completely different. Right now, cargo ships carry goods across oceans every day, connecting countries and driving global trade. Without the sea, international shipping would collapse. Everything from oil and gas to clothing and electronics would become harder to move. The cost of everyday items would rise and supply chains would fall apart. People would have to rely more on trains, planes, and land routes, but those methods are slower, more expensive, and not built to handle everything ships can carry. Tourism would take a massive hit too. Beaches, coral reefs, cruises, and seaside resorts would all be gone. Entire industries built around ocean tourism would disappear. Towns that used to welcome millions of visitors every year would lose their main source of income. Jobs in hospitality, water sports, and marine conservation would vanish, forcing people to move inland and search for new work in already crowded cities. The cultural impact would be just as huge. Think about how much of human history, art, and tradition is tied to the ocean. Stories of sea monsters, sailors, shipwrecks, and ocean gods would start to feel like distant fairy tales. Music, books, and movies about the sea would become a reflection of something lost. Even holidays and traditions based around the coast, like surfing festivals or seafood feasts, would disappear. People living far from the old ocean would grow up never hearing waves, smelling salt in the air, or seeing the sun rise over water. A major part of our connection to nature would be gone forever. The land left behind by the ocean would not be easy to live on. Much of it would be dry, salty, and full of strange, deep trenches and underwater mountains. It might take centuries before we could even build on it. Some explorers would probably try to cross the vast ocean floor, looking for secrets buried under the waves for millions of years, but without careful planning, these places would be dangerous and unstable, riddled with cracks, sinkholes, and sharp rock formations. In the long term, the human race would be forced to rethink how we live on this planet. Cities would need to be redesigned. Energy sources would need to be replaced since we'd lose ocean power. Like tides and waves, entire ecosystems would have to be rebuilt, if possible. People might even start building massive artificial lakes or try to pull water from underground just to balance things out a little. But even with all that effort, the world would never feel the same again. Losing the ocean would change the planet forever. Life would go on, but in a way that feels unfamiliar, harder, and more isolated. This kind of scenario reminds us how deeply connected we are to Earth's natural systems. The ocean's not just water, it's life, culture, history, and balance. Without it, we would not only lose a part of the planet, we would lose a part of ourselves. Thanks for sticking with this wild thought experiment. If this gave you something to think about, share it with someone else, and maybe go take a look at the ocean if you're lucky enough to live near it. Just knowing it's still out there doing its job is something we shouldn't take for granted.